Hello there, and welcome to Scretum Histories, where curiosity finds its quiet corner and the stories of forgotten gods settle into the gentle rhythm of your thoughts. Tonight, we drift far beyond time itself, back to an age before words or breath, before memory had even learned to echo. In that stillness beneath the sky of the first world, there was a presence known by many names. Some called her Ninhursag, the Lady of the Mountain, the mother of all living, the hand that shaped both gods and men. Others whispered her name only in reverence, as if speaking it too loudly might stir something ancient from its rest. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I hope the quiet hum of this story wraps around you like soft twilight. And if this little journey brings you calm, if it slows the weight of the world for even a while, perhaps leave a like or subscribe, and help this small circle of calm find others who might need it too. Now, settle in, breathe, and let your thoughts drift where the ancient rivers once flowed, to the cradle of creation, where a goddess once moulded the first beings from the dust of eternity. Long before the rise of Sumer or the temples of Ur, long before the first cities carved the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, the land itself was said to breathe with divinity. The myth spoke of gods who walked not above, but among the clay. Their world was not separate from the earth, but woven into it, a landscape where sky and soil were one endless continuum of life, and within that living fabric, Ninhursag was both mother and maker. Her domain was the fertile highlands, the green ridges that caught the first light of dawn. She was called the Mountain Queen because the mountains, in the imagination of the ancients, were where heaven touched the ground. To them, the peaks were the spines of the world, the places where the gods could bend down and touch their creation. Ninhursag's story is one of both tenderness and design. In the oldest tablets, she's described as the one who kneads life like dough, her hands shaping clay into beings capable of bearing the burdens the gods themselves no longer wished to carry. But she was more than a sculptor. She was a scientist of creation, a figure so old that later myths could only describe her through symbols. Her domain was not war or chaos, but balance, the silent architecture that made existence possible. When the early priests and scribes spoke her name, they didn't imagine a deity of wrath or command, but a steady presence that worked in harmony with nature itself. She was the principle of life-given form. In the mythic memory of Sumer, the gods were not omnipotent in the way later cultures imagined divinity. They were powerful, yes, but they were also bound by the elements. They needed food, water, gold, and labour. The earth was a place of toil even for them, and it was said that in the earliest days of the world the gods themselves worked the rivers and fields. Over time this burden grew unbearable, and the divine council sought relief. That decision, practical, weary, almost human, would mark the beginning of everything. It was then that Ninhursag was called upon to create a new being, one that could take on the labour of the gods. The texts that survive, fragmented, damaged by millennia, tell this story in pieces. In one version, the gods gathered in the city of the heavens and lamented their fatigue. The earth had grown heavy with its own creation. The god Enki, lord of the waters and wisdom, proposed a solution. He would provide the divine essence, and Ninhursag, the womb of the earth, would shape it into a living vessel. Between them, matter and spirit would unite, and the first humans would rise. It was a transaction of sorts, a collaboration between intellect and nurture, logic and life. Ninhursag agreed, though not lightly. The myths suggest that she understood the implications of such creation better than any of the others. To make life was one thing, to bind it to service was another. But she followed through, and the work began. In the ancient hymn known as Enki and Ninma, she gathers the clay of the Abzu, the subterranean waters that represented the primal essence of the world. This clay was not ordinary earth. It was believed to be alive, infused with the energy of the gods themselves. Into this mixture she shaped figures, forms that mirrored the divine image yet were grounded in mortality. Then, in what reads almost like an ancient laboratory scene, the texts describe her fashioning several prototypes. Some were too weak, others malformed. Some could not stand or could not speak. Each failure was noted and each was given its own role, as if even imperfection had a place in creation. The process feels oddly empirical, as if trial and error were divine tools. It's here that one begins to see Ninhursag not as a figure of mythic abstraction, but as something closer to what we might call an engineer of life. The very idea of moulding beings from clay echoes the principles of biological design. The shaping of structure, the balance of form and function, the attempt to create something sustainable. The ancients, of course, did not think in such modern terms, but their language hints at an intuitive understanding of systems, how creation required adjustment, revision, even failure. The goddess was patient, deliberate. Creation was not an act of instant magic. It was work, sustained and careful. When the final form was ready, Enki provided the spark of life. In some versions, this spark came from the blood of a slain god, a symbolic infusion of divine essence into the mortal vessel. The union of earth and divinity was complete. Humanity, as the myths tell it, was born not from whim but from necessity, a species designed to serve a purpose. Yet beneath that utilitarian beginning lies a profound truth about the relationship between creator and creation. Ninhursag did not simply craft servants, she crafted reflections. In her shaping of mankind, she embedded the capacity to think, to question, to create. Whether she intended it or not, her design carried the seed of independence, this duality, obedience and autonomy, function and freedom, would echo throughout every myth that followed. Humans, though made to labour for the gods, soon developed their own desires, their own identities. The goddess, in shaping them, gave them more than the gods had bargained for. She had given them the possibility of choice. The stories of Ninhursag often describe her as both nurturing and severe, a mother who loves her creation but also enforces balance. When Enki, her counterpart, overstepped by consuming the sacred plants of Dilmun, the paradise of the gods, she was the one who inflicted illness upon him, not out of cruelty, but to restore equilibrium. Later, moved by compassion, she healed him, giving birth to new deities from each afflicted part of his body. This myth, though wrapped in divine imagery, captures something universal: the cycle of action, consequence, and renewal. Creation, in her hands, was not static. It was a living process, one that required both discipline and mercy. For the ancient Sumerians, Ninhursag embodied the principle that life itself was sacred work. Her symbols, mountains, trees, wombs, and rivers, represented fertility not just in the biological sense, but in the cosmic one. Everything living flowed from her, but everything also returned to her. Death, too, was part of her domain, not as punishment, but as continuation. The clay she used to form mankind was the same clay, to which they would one day return. In this way, creation was never final. It was circular, endlessly renewing. Archaeologists have found countless figurines across Mesopotamia that seem to echo her likeness. Women with exaggerated features, wide hips, and hands cradling swollen bellies. These were not idols of vanity, but tributes to the power of generation. In the world of early civilization, fertility was survival. The goddess who gave life to humans was also the one who sustained the soil, the animals, and the rhythms of the seasons. Her image, pressed into clay or carved into stone, was both prayer and acknowledgement, an ancient thank you to the source of continuity. What makes Ninhursag's myth particularly striking is how it intersects with ideas that echo far beyond Sumer. Across the ancient world, from Egypt to the Indus Valley, creation myths often speak of beings formed from earth or clay. It's a universal metaphor, but it also carries a strange familiarity, as if all early cultures intuited the same truth, that we are made of the same materials as the world itself. Modern science would one day confirm this. Our body is composed of carbon, iron, oxygen, and water, the same elements that shape the soil and stars. What the Sumerians expressed in myth, we now describe in chemistry. In both, the message is the same. We are of the earth, and the earth is of us. For those who believed in the Anunnaki, the great gods who came from the heavens, Ninhursag's role was foundational. She was the genetic artisan of humanity, the one who bridged divine intention with material form. Later interpretations, drawn from both myth and speculation, would cast her as an ancient biotechnologist, a being who used advanced knowledge to engineer life. Whether one sees these stories as literal or symbolic, their persistence speaks to something deep in human imagination, the need to believe that life was shaped with purpose. In Sumerian hymns, her voice is quiet but firm, her presence steady and maternal. She was invoked in rituals of birth and healing, her name spoken to bless the fields, the herds, and the wombs of women. Her temples, often built on elevated ground, mirrored her title as Lady of the Mountain. From these sanctuaries, priests would oversee offerings of grain and milk, the simplest, most vital gifts meant to honour the one who made sustenance itself possible. When we read these myths today, it's easy to see them as distant echoes, curiosities from a world long vanished. Yet, beneath their ancient language, there's a surprisingly modern tone. The story of a creator who experiments, who learns, who nurtures yet enforces balance. It feels timeless. The ancients may have wrapped their understanding of biology and ecology in divine imagery, but their insight was profound. They saw life as interconnected, every act of creation balanced by responsibility. Ninhursag's tale is not merely a story of beginnings, it's a meditation on the ethics of creation. To make life is to take on the duty of care, to shape not just form but consequence. Her myths remind us that creation is not triumph, but stewardship. The clay she moulded was not inert, it was conscious, and with consciousness came complexity, joy, curiosity, rebellion, and sorrow. In later ages, her figure faded into other names. To the Akkadians, she became known as Belet Ili, the Lady of the Gods. In Babylon, she merged with Mami or Aruru, the creators of mankind in other traditions. Even in the echoes of the Hebrew Bible, one can sense faint traces of her archetype. The earth-shaping of Adam, the maternal breath that animates dust into life. Her essence scattered but never lost, woven quietly through every culture that wondered how life began. The beauty of Ninhursag's story lies in its calm inevitability. Creation, in her hands, is not an act of conquest, but of continuity. The world unfolds not through command, but through nurture. Her myth begins not with thunder, but with the whisper of fingers pressing clay, the sound of water mingling with earth, the pulse of something new learning to move. And so, the story begins to open. The goddess, the mountain, the breath within the clay, all set the stage for what would come after. The awakening of a world, the rise of gods and men, and the quiet, steady hand of the mother who made them both. The earth was still young then, and her work had only just begun. The first light of the world did not rise from the flatlands, but from the ridges that brushed the edge of the sky. In the myths of Sumer, before the first cities, before even the gods took their thrones, the mountains were seen as the pillars of creation, the boundary where the visible and the invisible touched. It was said that within these mountains, in the hollows between stone and cloud, Ninhursag first stirred. She was not born in the way mortals are born, but rather awakened, as if the world itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. The ancients imagined that when the mountains first lifted themselves from the primordial sea, they did so with purpose. like the bones of the earth stretching upward toward the stars, and that in that gesture of ascent consciousness emerged. The mountains were her body, the rivers her veins, the green plains her breath. To understand why the mountain was sacred to the Sumerians is to glimpse how deeply they felt the rhythm of their world. They lived in the plains, where the rivers brought life but also destruction, where floods erased boundaries and seasons demanded precision. The mountains, distant and misted, were a mystery, a place where rain was born and minerals slept. They were the origin of rivers and the keepers of storms. In a landscape where everything depended on water, the mountains were the silent source of all sustenance. To them they were divine, eternal and watchful. It was only natural that the goddess who embodied fertility, birth and creation would dwell there. Ninhursag was called Lady of the Mountain, not for poetic grandeur but because the mountain itself was the eternal womb, a place of beginnings. In one of the oldest hymns to her name, the scribes describe her rising from the horizon like dawn upon the peaks, her figure both human and cosmic. She was the high place where heaven met the soil. The mountain summit, they said, was the first temple ever built, and its foundations ran deeper than any man could dig. It was not built by hands, but by the quiet labour of the world itself. To stand upon such a mountain was to stand where gods were born. The mythology of Ninhursag carries the quiet echo of something older than Sumerian civilization, perhaps older than civilization itself. Archaeologists have found fragments of her worship in the earliest levels of Eridu, the world's first city, and in the uplands near modern-day Jebel Hamrin and Zagros. Even before the first bricks of temples were laid, the people of those regions seem to have offered clay figurines and woven ornaments to the hills. They did not yet write, but they understood that something sacred pulsed within the earth's height. The highlands were the mother's spine. When we read the ancient tablets today, the language is both foreign and familiar. The scribes wrote of Ninhursag not as a distant deity, but as a presence that could be felt in the wind that cooled the soil after rain, in the sprouting of reeds, and in the rhythm of birth. Her mountain was both real and symbolic, a place of refuge for the gods, but also a metaphor for stability, endurance, and shelter. The texts often pair her with An, the Sky Father, and Enlil, the Lord of the Air, making her the terrestrial counterpart to their celestial dominion. Where they ruled the heavens, she ruled the flesh of the world. Without her, the sky had nothing to stand upon. There is a passage in the hymn to Ninhursag that reads, "She who nurtures kings and feeds the gods, whose house is the breast of the earth." Scholars often translate that line literally, but within it lies the essence of how the Sumerians understood divinity. For them, creation was not a moment, but a cycle. The goddess did not simply make and leave, she sustained, replenished, and renewed. Her home in the mountains was not a palace of marble, but a place of springs and roots. The mountain was the earth's living heart, and she was its pulse. When the ancients spoke of her awakening, they did not mean that she appeared suddenly, but that awareness arose within the material world itself. The mountain was where the earth opened its eyes. Later myths would turn this image into narrative, the goddess stepping out of stone, her feet dripping with the waters of the deep, her hands carrying seeds from the unseen. She was said to walk down from the heights into the valleys, bringing with her the knowledge of cultivation, the wisdom of tending life. In this image, Ninhursag becomes the bridge between wilderness and civilization, between the chaos of the natural world and the order of human settlement. It is no coincidence that the earliest temples dedicated to her were built on raised platforms, artificial mountains known as ziggurats. To the people of Sumer, these were not merely monuments, but attempts to recreate the primeval mountain of creation, to bring heaven and earth closer once more. The ziggurat of Eresh, for instance, was said to have been built in her honour, a place where the priestesses could ascend toward the heavens during rituals that mark the changing of the seasons. Each level represented a layer of the cosmos, from the underworld to the sky, and at its summit, offerings of milk, honey and grain were made to Ninhursag, the eternal mother. When those ceremonies took place, the city below would fall silent. Only the sounds of flutes, wind, and chanting filled the air. The hymns described her as descending softly in the breeze, resting upon the temple's top as she once rested on the peaks. To the worshippers below, that moment was not symbolic, it was real. The presence of the goddess was the turning of time itself, the assurance that the world would continue another season, that birth and growth would follow decay. It's difficult for the modern mind to grasp how total this sense of connection must have been. To them, divinity wasn't abstract, it was physical, observable. When rain fell, it was Ninhursag's milk nourishing the soil. When crops sprouted, it was her blessing. When the mountains erupted in thunder or tremor, it was her breath stirring. And when the rivers overflowed, drowning fields and washing away homes, it wasn't seen as punishment, but as the raw pulse of the living world. The goddess was not a separate being to be feared or flattered. She was the system itself, the sum of every balance. In later traditions, as power in Mesopotamia shifted and the pantheon reorganized, her image evolved. She became the consort of Enki, the counterpart to his intellect and invention. Where he represented the creative mind, she embodied the creative body. Their union symbolized not romance but synthesis, thought meeting form, knowledge meeting nature. It was in their cooperation that humanity would be conceived, an echo of the balance between mountain and water, land and river, masculine and feminine, idea and realization. The mountain remained the image of her essence throughout these transformations. Even when her name changed, from Ninhursag to Ninmah, from Ninmah to Oruru, the mountain never left her identity. The scribes continued to associate her with the high places, the rocks that bore inscriptions, the peaks where the gods convened. It was believed that the divine council met not in the sky, but upon a mountain called Eka, the house of the mountain. That word, Eka, would become the prototype for later temples throughout Mesopotamia, and it was always tied to her. The temple was the mountain, and the mountain was the goddess. To imagine her awakening then is to imagine the world itself beginning to organize, to take shape. The chaotic waters receding, the first green shoots piercing the mud, the mountains lifting their crowns into the light. The goddess opens her eyes, and the act of seeing becomes creation. Her awakening is the dawn of stability, the moment when the elements recognize one another and begin to cooperate. Air settles into the sky, earth holds its form, and water learns its boundaries. The myth translates what must have been an overwhelming observation. That order exists, that the world functions with precision and rhythm. For early humanity, that realization was divine. There is something profoundly human about how they told it. The mountain becomes a mind, the earth becomes a body, creation becomes awakening. Beneath the layers of myth, one can almost sense the first scientists and farmers forming their cosmology not from imagination alone, but from observation. They watched storms gather around mountain peaks, saw snow melt into rivers, followed those rivers into fertile plains. They knew, instinctively, that everything began up there. The goddess, in that sense, was geography turned into theology. Over the centuries, her worship adapted to the needs of new ages. When agriculture spread, she became the goddess of fields and fertility. When cities rose, she became the protector of rulers and bloodlines. But her essence never changed. She was the giver of structure. To create was not to dominate, but to balance. Her mountain was not only the origin, but the reminder that even the heavens rest upon something solid, and that all order begins from below. The priests who tended her temples spoke of her as ever-present, though rarely visible. Unlike the storm gods or the lords of the underworld, she did not demand thunder or fear. Her power was quiet, sustaining, almost maternal. The records describe rituals performed in her honor during childbirth, harvest, and even construction. The laying of the first brick in any temple was accompanied by a prayer to Ninhursag, asking that the structure stand firm as the mountains do. That ritual continued for centuries, long after her direct worship waned, hidden beneath new names and new pantheons. If one looks closely, traces of her can still be found in later myths. The Akkadian goddess Belet Ili, who moulds humans from clay, the Babylonian Aruru, who forms Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the motherly figures of Anatolia and Canaan, all echo her hand. Even in Greek myth, the image of Gaia rising from the earth carries her shadow. The archetype persisted, carried through trade routes, oral traditions, and the shared wonder of creation. For the Sumerians, however, the mountain was more than symbol. It was sanctuary. When cities fell, when floods swept across the plain, the people looked to the highlands for safety. In their stories, that instinct became cosmic truth. When chaos returned, the goddess would rise again from the mountain, just as she had in the beginning. The idea that the world could be renewed, that life could be remade, rested upon her promise. The clay that once became flesh could become so again. The legend of her awakening in the mountains thus became a kind of reassurance, a reminder that no collapse was final. The cycles of the world, flood and drought, growth and decay, birth and death, were not ends but renewals. The goddess slept, but she always woke. Her breath returned in the winds of spring. Her pulse returned in the rivers. Her voice returned in the hum of insects and the rustle of crops. To live in the Sumerian world was to live within her, always surrounded by her quiet persistence. As time went on, and her temples fell into ruin, the memory of her did not vanish. Instead, it merged with new forms. She became, in spirit, the earth itself, the maternal constant beneath the ever-changing sky. Her story endured because it spoke to something beyond myth. It described the relationship between humans and their world, a dependence so deep it could only be expressed through reverence. The mountain, still standing through ages of erosion, became the perfect metaphor for that endurance. And so, when we imagine Ninhursag awakening in those ancient mountains, we might think of it less as a divine miracle and more as an ancient understanding made flesh. The people of that time looked at the world and saw order rising from chaos, fertility emerging from stone, balance between the wild and the cultivated. They gave that awareness a name, and that name was hers. The mountains still hold that same quiet presence. Their slopes gather clouds as they always have. Their rivers still carve paths toward the plains. In every raindrop that falls and every seed that takes root, the essence of Ninhursag lingers. The reminder that creation is not a single act, but an endless awakening. That the earth itself is conscious, ancient, and alive. The world would move on from those early mountains. The cities would rise, the gods would multiply, and the myths would grow more complex. But in every story that followed, every tablet, every ritual, every whisper of the divine, the echo of the mountain remained. It was where heaven first bent toward the earth, where life first opened its eyes, and where the mother of all things took her first breath. And so, as the winds settle across the ridges of forgotten peaks, the story continues, downward, toward the plains, where the gods began their labour and where the need for creation would soon call her forth again. Before there were cities, before there were kings, before there was even the idea of humankind, the world, according to the ancient Sumerians, was already awake. The heavens had stretched into their endless expanse, the waters had receded just enough for the dry land to breathe, and the first divine beings walked the surface of a world still steaming from its birth. The earth was young then, rich, wet, and full of energy, but it was also stubborn. The work of shaping it was hard, even for the gods. In those earliest of days, the gods were not distant overseers. They were labourers, engineers, and caretakers of creation. The Sumerian tablets describe them as beings of purpose, each responsible for maintaining a portion of the world. They dredged the rivers, raised the embankments, managed the floods, and tended the fertile soil that would one day feed millions. It was divine agriculture in its rawest form. Heaven and earth were still learning to coexist, and the gods were the ones tasked with keeping them in balance. The Sumerians imagined their gods much as they imagined themselves. Powerful, but not omnipotent. Wise, but not infallible. They needed rest, sustenance, and cooperation. They held councils, quarrelled, and compromised. They were reflections of the natural order they governed, interconnected, interdependent, and occasionally overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of existence. The cosmos itself, in their telling, was a kind of kingdom under perpetual construction. Among these divine workers were the Anunnaki, the great assembly of gods who served under the higher deities An, Enlil, and Enki. They were not ethereal beings of light, but tangible presences, builders, organisers, and record-keepers. The texts speak of them as craftsmen shaping the world with their hands, laying out irrigation canals, piling soil to form levees, and digging the beds of rivers that still trace the Mesopotamian plain. The word Anunnaki itself, though often interpreted as those who came from the heavens, carried an older, more functional meaning. The princely seed, the divine orderers of the earth. But even gods, it seems, could tire. The clay tablets known as the Atrahasis epic tell us that after long ages of toil, the lesser gods, the Igigi, grew weary of their endless labour. They had been assigned the maintenance of the world, and the work was unrelenting. Year after year they dug canals, tended the fields, and managed the balance between flood and drought. They complained that their tasks had no end. The world required constant attention. Every harvest brought new floods. Every flood demanded new repairs. The gods who once found joy in creation now felt the weight of its maintenance. The texts describe their discontent in simple, almost human terms. The Igigi murmured among themselves, gathering in secret. Their complaints rose like smoke to the heavens. Our work is too great, one tablet reads. The toil is endless. Let us rise against our overseers. And so, under the darkness of night, they did. The gods laid down their tools, burned their spades, and marched to the gates of Enlil's great temple. The sound of their rebellion shook the heavens. Enlil, the lord of air and authority, was furious. He had organised the divine order, assigned roles, and expected obedience. To see his own ranks in revolt was unthinkable. The gods' outcry, however, could not be ignored. They were exhausted, not from laziness, but from imbalance. The world, it turned out, was more demanding than even the divine had anticipated. Their revolt forced a reckoning. Something would have to change. The higher gods, An, Enlil, and Enki, gathered in council. The question before them was not punishment, but solution. How could creation sustain itself if even the gods could not endure its upkeep? Enki, ever the thinker, proposed an answer that would alter existence forever. If the labour of the gods was too great, then they would need to share it. A new being could be fashioned, one capable of physical endurance suited to the rhythms of the earth, yet intelligent enough to serve divine instruction. It was in that moment, the myths say, that the idea of humanity was conceived. But before such a being could exist, the gods still had to work. The world was not yet ready for life. The soil was rich but unorganized. The rivers flowed freely, often destructively. The first temples were not yet built, and the laws that bound heaven to earth had not yet been inscribed. For now, the divine builders continued their tasks, shaping the land piece by piece, preparing it for the beings that would one day inherit it. The Sumerians, in telling this story, were not describing a distant miracle, but explaining the structure of reality as they saw it. The idea that even gods must labour suggested that existence itself was built on effort and cooperation. The irrigation canals that crisscrossed their fields were mirrors of divine ones, the plough a smaller echo of cosmic work. Life was not granted freely. It was maintained daily, through sweat, discipline and care. If you walk today through the ancient riverbeds of Mesopotamia, you can still trace that divine architecture. The canals, though long dry, follow paths that once defined kingdoms. The very layout of those systems hints at the depth of thought behind them, geometry, proportion, an understanding of hydrology that seems impossibly advanced for its time. To the Sumerians, such precision was no accident. It was inherited knowledge, passed down from the gods who first worked the earth. Among those divine labourers, Ninhursag held a unique role. While the male gods were often associated with control and order, the measuring of water, the command of storms, Ninhursag was the living counterpart, the principle of fertility that made all their work meaningful. Without her, the fields would not yield, the rivers would not nourish, and the balance they laboured to preserve would collapse. She was not simply a goddess watching from the mountains, she was the sustaining presence within the soil itself. Every furrow turned by the divine plough was, in their eyes, an act of communion with her. Her relationship with Enki during this time was one of complementary necessity. While he governed the waters, she governed what those waters touched. Enki could flood the land with wisdom and abundance, but it was Ninhursag who turned that potential into growth. Together, they formed the cycle that defined Sumerian cosmology. Wisdom and nurture, thought and form, sky and earth, male and female, intellect and instinct. Creation was not an act of domination but of collaboration. There is an old fragment found in the ruins of Nippur that describes their work before the making of man. It speaks of the gods, lifting the hills, fixing the rivers in their beds, and carving the channels where the waters may rest. The imagery feels more geological than divine, suggesting that these myths may have encoded real memories of environmental engineering, perhaps the earliest attempts to control the wild floods of the Tigris and Euphrates. To the Sumerians, such feats of hydrology were divine acts, so it is no wonder they imagined gods performing them first. The world they inherited was unpredictable. Floods could come without warning, destroying everything, or fail to come at all, leaving the land cracked and lifeless. The delicate balance between these extremes was the foundation of civilization itself. The idea that gods once struggled with the same problem was comforting. It meant that humanity's labour mirrored a cosmic story, that toil was not punishment, but inheritance. In this pre-human age, the gods' world seems almost pastoral. The tablets describe gardens, rivers, and settlements, not as metaphors but as literal divine spaces. The gods had homes, food, and communities. They brewed beer, baked bread, and shared in ritual meals. In many ways, they were the prototypes of the humans to come, living examples of what civilization would one day become. The distinction between divine and mortal was not in form but in origin. The gods were made of the heavens, mankind would be made of the earth. The rebellion of the Agii, however, revealed a problem in that divine order. Labour, though necessary, required balance. Creation could not exist if even the creators grew weary of it. The council's decision to fashion a new race was both pragmatic and fateful. It acknowledged that the world's maintenance was eternal, and that new hands would be needed to share the burden. The gods' struggle was the first story of work, a theme that would echo through every civilization thereafter. When the moment came for the great experiment to begin, the myths tell us that Ninhursag's hands were the first to touch the clay. It is as though all her earlier work, the tending of mountains, the shaping of rivers, the nurturing of soil, had been preparation for this single act. The world she had cared for would now give birth through her. The same clay that had been the foundation of divine labour would become the material for a new kind of life. But that moment was still far away. Before she could mould anything living, the balance between heaven and earth had to be perfected. The myths linger on this transition, describing the earth not as empty chaos, but as half-finished order. The gods continued their labour, smoothing the plains, deepening the waters, stabilising the sky. Their work was the shaping of environment itself. Each god contributed to a different element. Enlil separated the winds, Enki set boundaries for rivers, Ninhursag filled the soil with vitality. It was a cooperative effort on a scale that defies imagination, and yet beneath the grandeur of these divine actions lies a subtle truth about human awareness. The Sumerians who composed these stories were, in their own way, describing the process of domestication, the transformation of wilderness into landscape, of chaos into agriculture. The gods' toil was a mirror of their own. Just as the divine beings once laboured to stabilise the world, so too did the first farmers labour to tame the floodplain. The myths became both memory and manual. There is something deeply humbling in how the story portrays even gods as workers. It strips divinity of arrogance and replaces it with endurance. Creation was not a gift freely given, but a task continuously performed. The idea that the world requires constant care, by gods first, by humans later, carried moral weight. It meant that existence itself depended on maintenance, that survival was a shared duty. When the Igigi finally laid down their tools, it was not rebellion for its own sake. It was a cry for balance, for relief. And that cry, paradoxically, became the seed of humanity's birth. In the Sumerian worldview, every problem contained its own creation. The exhaustion of the divine gave rise to the ingenuity of the mortal. The goddess who had shaped mountains would now shape something far smaller, yet infinitely more complex, a being capable of thought, emotion, and perseverance. That transition from gods to humans, from divine labour to human hands, marks one of the great turning points in mythic history. It is the moment when the roles of creator and caretaker began to blur. Humanity, when it finally appeared, would inherit both the earth and the labour that sustained it. They would become the continuation of the gods' unfinished work. In this way, the story of the gods who worked the earth is not just the prologue to human existence. It is the foundation of every philosophy that followed. The Sumerians saw no separation between work and worship, between the sacred and the practical. To plough a field, to dig a canal, to build a wall, these were acts of alignment with the divine. Every gesture of cultivation was a reenactment of the gods' original toil. And so, in the silence before humanity, the gods bent their backs to the soil and continued their work. Their sweat mixed with the clay, their breath with the wind. The rivers gleamed like silver veins across the land. The air shimmered with heat, but the mountain peaks were cool and watchful. The world was preparing itself, shaping the conditions for what would come next. In that quiet labour, the goddess waited. Her patience was endless. She knew that creation was not a single act, but a sequence of careful steps, each dependent on the last. The others might grow weary, but she understood that even fatigue had its purpose. From weariness would come inspiration. From rebellion would come invention. From divine exhaustion would come the human spark. The earth settled into rhythm. The rivers ran smoother. The floods became seasons rather than catastrophes. The gods' work began to take form, and for the first time there was balance enough for something new to grow. Ninhursag watched as the soil ripened under her care, as the clay took on the scent of life. The world was ready. The gods had built its structure. The time had come for her to fill it. The clay that had borne the weight of divine labour would soon bear a different kind of burden, the consciousness of those who would continue that labour in her name. And so, as the gods rested from their long work, she began hers. The mountain mother bent low over the earth once more, and the long silence before humanity began to break. The moment when life began, according to the oldest stories of Sumer, was not marked by thunder or flame, but by stillness. The gods had finished their work upon the world. The rivers flowed where they should. The mountains stood in their ordained silence, and the plains shimmered under the sun like new bronze. But even in all that order there was emptiness. The fields lay bare of purpose. The divine builders had built a perfect stage, yet there were no actors to walk upon it. It was at that quiet hour that Ninhursag turned her gaze downward and saw the waiting earth. The clay, soft and dark, was unlike any substance in the heavens. It was pliant yet enduring, humble yet full of potential. To the goddess, it was familiar, the same material that had birthed mountains, the same soil that drank the rains and returned them as rivers. In its dampness she felt her own reflection. She knew that within its grains slept the seeds of something greater, something capable of carrying the spark of the gods themselves. It was from that sacred soil that life would take its first form. The Sumerians described this act in language at once simple and profound. In the hymn known as the Birth of Mankind, they wrote that Ninhursag mixed the clay of the Abzu with the flesh of the gods. The Abzu, that hidden ocean beneath the earth, was thought to be the reservoir of all potential, the deep, silent water from which creation drew its vitality. To mix its clay was to merge heaven's intention with the earth's body. The result would not be mere animation, but awareness. In one version of the story, Ninhursag began her work in the presence of Enki. He, the keeper of knowledge, provided the plan. She, the mother of all living, gave it shape. The workshop of the gods was not a temple but a cradle of earth. The two divine figures gathered materials not from the heavens but from the soil itself. They took handfuls of wet clay, heavy and cool, and began to mould. The image they formed was not that of a god, but of a being who could live upon the land, breathe its air, and work its fields. The goddess pressed her fingers into the clay, tracing forms that would one day walk upright, think, and remember. The process was not instant. Each attempt was a conversation between possibility and limitation. The first forms were fragile, unable to stand. The next was strong, but without reason. Some could breathe but not speak. Others could move but not feel. The myths tell of Ninhursag adjusting each creation, as if testing the boundaries of what life could endure. Her laboratory was not of stone, but of time itself. She learned through making. It was creation as craft, guided not by omnipotence but by patience. Enki, ever analytical, observed each outcome. He measured their movements, noted their failings, and offered suggestions. The pair worked like partners in experiment, the divine equivalents of sculptor and scholar. Each failure brought refinement, each attempt closer to balance. The gods who watched from afar grew restless, but Ninhursag paid them no mind. She knew that haste was the enemy of harmony. Life, to last, must be shaped with care. At last she found the formula that satisfied both her intuition and the divine will. She mixed the clay with the essence of the gods. Some said it was the blood of a slain deity, others that it was the breath of Enki himself. Either way, it was a fusion of spirit and matter. When she pressed her hands into the mixture, it pulsed faintly, as if responding. She smiled then, for she understood what she was about to do. She was not creating servants. She was creating continuity. The first of these beings, according to the legend, stirred as she set them upon the ground. They opened their eyes and breathed in the air that had belonged only to the gods. Their movements were slow at first, uncertain, like newborn animals testing their limbs. But soon they began to mimic the gestures of their makers. They looked upon Ninhursag with the awe of recognition, as if seeing in her the origin not only of their bodies, but of the strange light flickering within them. That flicker was thought, and with it came awareness. The gods had designed workers, but Ninhursag had given them something far more complicated, the gift of self. It was not rebellion, not yet, but the potential for it, the seed of curiosity that would one day grow into memory, language, and question. Whether she intended it or not, she had made something that could reflect upon its own existence. To the ancients, this moment was not mythic metaphor, but sacred history. They believed that in the clay of the riverbeds lay the literal residue of divine creation. Archaeologists have found early votive figures shaped from that same clay, small offerings left in the belief that the substance itself carried divine memory. It was not just dirt, it was the material of life, sanctified by the goddess's touch. The story of how she formed the first beings is told in different ways across Sumerian and Akkadian texts, but one image repeats: the womb. Ninhursag was called Nintu, Lady of Birth. Her temple was known as Isagila, the womb house. These were not symbolic names. They described the literal act of divine gestation. In some accounts, the goddess did not merely shape clay figures, she brought them to life within herself. She carried them as embryos in her own body, then released them into the world. To the people who told these stories, creation was inseparable from motherhood. Life was not commanded into being, it was laboured into existence. The language of the tablets lingers on that labour. They describe the goddess groaning with effort, the other deities standing by offering chants and guidance. When the first human emerged, the heavens themselves were said to tremble with joy. The lesser gods bowed before Ninhursag and declared her Mami, the mother of all. The work of creation was complete, or so they believed. Yet even in their triumph, a quiet tension remained. The humans, though made to relieve the gods of toil, were fragile. They required constant care. They needed food, shelter, instruction. The gods soon discovered that creation carried responsibility. Ninhursag, ever patient, took it upon herself to teach her new children. She showed them how to plant seeds, how to bake bread, how to shape vessels from the same clay that had shaped them. In this way, the myth of creation flowed seamlessly into the myth of civilization. The goddess who made humans also made them capable of sustaining themselves. It is in these early myths that one can trace the roots of Sumerian ethics. Creation was not an act of dominance, but of partnership. The gods had built the world, now humans would maintain it. The relationship was symbiotic. The gods needed offerings and rituals to sustain their essence, while humans needed divine order to sustain their survival. Between the two stood Ninhursag, the mediator, the mother who balanced divine expectation with mortal limitation. Her influence extended beyond myth into daily life. In every Sumerian city, childbirth rituals invoked her name. Women in labour called upon the lady of the birth house to guide them safely. Farmers offered her the first fruits of the harvest, acknowledging that the soil's fertility was her gift. Even the act of moulding clay for pottery was done with a quiet reverence, a remembrance of her first creative gesture. The human hand pressing clay was an imitation of the divine hand that had once done the same. In later centuries, when scribes recorded these stories on tablets, they often added small details that reveal how deeply this myth had become entwined with practical knowledge. One text describes the clay as being mixed with the blood of a god who had intelligence, so that the new beings might inherit understanding. Another claims that Enki added his word, his wisdom, to the mixture, as if programming the clay with knowledge. Modern readers might see echoes of genetic metaphor in those lines, the transfer of divine information into mortal form. Whether by design or coincidence, the language of creation sounds remarkably like the language of engineering. To the people who lived under the shadow of ziggurats, this connection between matter and spirit was not strange at all. The world was full of correspondences. The same principle that caused seeds to sprout also caused ideas to grow. The same rhythm that guided childbirth guided the flooding of rivers. The goddess was the pattern that unified all things. To create life, she had only to repeat the pattern on a new scale. The story of Ninhursag's creation of humanity also carries a subtle undercurrent of compassion. When the gods complained of their labour, she might have ignored them, letting them bear the weight of their choices. Instead, she chose empathy. She saw their exhaustion and responded not with anger, but with creation. Her solution was not destruction, not escape, but expansion. By creating new life, she distributed the burden more evenly. To the Sumerians, this act embodied the highest divine virtue, balance through generosity. There is a detail in one Akkadian retelling that stands out. it says that after the first humans were formed, Ninhursag looked upon them and wept. The tears fell upon their faces and became their first moisture, the divine condensation that made them truly alive. Scholars interpret this as poetic symbolism, but perhaps it reflects something more profound, the recognition that creation is also loss. By giving the world her children, she also surrendered part of herself. The gods would no longer be alone in their labour, but neither would they be singular in their purpose. Life had multiplied, and with it came uncertainty. As centuries passed, the tale of that sacred clay spread far beyond Sumer. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians each adapted it to their own tongues and beliefs. Yet the image of the goddess shaping humanity endured. Even the biblical story of Adam's creation from dust seems to echo the same ancient scene. The parallels are striking. The divine breath animating earth, the garden setting, the sense of intimacy between creator and creation. Across time, the act of moulding life from soil became a universal metaphor for the bond between matter and spirit. For Ninhursag's people, the story held one more layer of meaning. The same clay from which they believed humans were made was also the clay they used to record their knowledge. Every tablet, every inscription was a continuation of her work. Writing itself was an extension of creation, pressing marks into earth to give thought permanence, just as she had pressed form into earth to give it life. In a sense, every scribe was a descendant not just of her creatures, but of her craft. The womb of the gods, as the Sumerians imagined it, was not a mystical void, but a tangible process, patient, methodical, and deeply physical. They saw no separation between the biological and the divine. The goddess's body and the earth's body were one and the same. When crops grew, it was her fertility manifest. When rivers flooded, it was her blood renewing the soil. When children were born, her labour echoed in every cry. Creation was not confined to the past. It was continuous, an eternal rhythm that pulsed through every living thing. Even in later periods, when her worship began to fade under the dominance of newer gods, the old hymns preserved her tone. Calm, nurturing, and infinitely resilient. They spoke of her hands as gentle as the dew, her wisdom as the quiet of dawn before the birds awaken. She did not rule by fear, nor by spectacle, but by the enduring fact of life itself. The earth could quake, empires could rise and fall, but the soil always waited to be shaped again. And perhaps that is why her myth survived so long. It did not depend on power or conquest. It rested on something far older and more reliable. The simple act of creation, repeated endlessly in every seed, every birth, every breath. The womb of the gods was not a place to be found, but a pattern to be remembered. The ancients believed that if one pressed their hand into fresh clay and felt its cool resistance, they could still sense the pulse of that first act. The material of the world retained the memory of its maker. In that touch, they said, the distance between divine and human vanished. Both were sculptors, both were creations, and both were part of the same ongoing work. As the first humans learned to till the soil and raise the walls of their cities, they carried that inheritance unknowingly. Each gesture of their hands, each rhythm of their labour, echoed the goddess's own. The world she had shaped from sacred soil continued to shape itself through them. The line between creation and creator blurred, until all that remained was the quiet persistence of life, forever forming, forever reforming in the womb of the earth. And so, the story moves onward, carried by that same pulse, toward the moment when the divine experiment would deepen, when paradise itself would bloom under her care, and when the perfection she had built would inevitably be tested. When the world was still fresh and the first humans had only just begun to stir, there was harmony between the heavens and the earth. The gods watched from their cities of light as their new creations learned to walk, to plant, to speak. It was a time the old hymns would later call the Golden Age, when rivers flowed without flood, and the soil bore fruit without labour. The goddess Ninhursag tended to her children like a patient mother, teaching them the rhythms of the earth, when to sow, when to harvest, when to let the land rest. Beside her stood Enki, the lord of water and wisdom, whose mind had conceived the very idea of creation. Together they were the balance that held the world steady. She, the body, he, the thought. Their partnership was not one of command but of necessity. Each completed what the other lacked. Enki's domain was the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the ground, the source of all rivers and the wellspring of knowledge. His mind was as vast as the ocean, ceaselessly generating ideas, schemes, and inventions. Ninhursag's realm was the surface, the mountains, the valleys, the breathing world of soil and seed. Where his thoughts flowed without rest, hers grounded them, giving them form and endurance. To the Sumerians, this union was not merely symbolic. It was the blueprint of existence itself. The meeting of intellect and fertility was what made life possible. In the myths, they are described as companions in creation, two aspects of the same divine intention. Enki designed, Ninhursag embodied. He was the pattern, she the realization. When he imagined irrigation, she carved the rivers. When he conceived the order of the seasons, she breathed it into the wind. Together they shaped a world that could sustain itself. But even in paradise, perfection trembles beneath the weight of curiosity. Among all the gods, Enki was the most inquisitive. His mind was never still. He sought to understand not only what existed, but what might exist. The myths often portray him as a benevolent tinkerer, endlessly adjusting creation, as though the universe were an instrument that could be tuned. Ninhursag, ever patient, indulged his curiosity but watched with quiet concern. To her, creation was sacred. To him, it was a puzzle. And though both loved the world they had built, their views of it were not the same. There is an old story preserved on worn tablets found near Nippur that captures the essence of their relationship. It tells of a place called Dilmun, the land of purity, where sickness and death were unknown. It was the paradise of the gods, a garden of eternal mourning. There Ninhursag and Enki dwelt for a time, watching over the new beings who tilled the soil and tended the gardens. The waters flowed sweetly, the air was gentle, and the earth yielded its gifts without toil. It was said that lions and gazelles drank from the same pools, that no child cried, and no mother wept. The world was complete, yet even paradise invites experimentation. Enki, ever restless, wandered through Dilmun, studying its wonders. He observed the plants that grew there, grasses, herbs, fruits and flowers, each thriving without decay. Every root and leaf fascinated him. According to the myth, he began to taste them one by one, drawn by the curiosity of a scientist and the appetite of a god. Each plant carried a hidden virtue. One healed the heart, another strengthened the bones, another restored the spirit. Enki consumed them all, not out of greed, but from a desire to understand their secrets. When Ninhursag learned what he had done, her calm turned to fury. Those plants, she declared, were sacred. They were meant to remain untouched, symbols of the harmony between creation and restraint. By consuming them, Enki had disturbed the order she had so carefully nurtured. Knowledge once taken could not be returned. The act was irreversible. The texts describe what happened next with quiet gravity. Enki fell ill. The life within him turned chaotic. Each organ of his body began to ache, and the balance of his divine form was thrown into disarray. The wisdom he had consumed now consumed him. His mind, which had once seen the order of the cosmos so clearly, grew clouded. The gods gathered in alarm, unsure how to heal him. Only Ninhursag, the mother of all, could restore what had been broken. But in her anger she withdrew, vowing never to look upon him again. For a time the world trembled. The rivers slowed, the plants withered, the earth grew silent. The balance between water and soil, between Enki and Ninhursag, had been severed. Without harmony between them, creation itself began to weaken. The younger gods begged her to relent, to return to her partner and restore the order of the world. At last, moved by compassion for her creation, she descended from the mountains and came to the place where Enki lay. She found him pale and still, his breath shallow. One by one she placed her hands upon the afflicted parts of his body. Wherever she touched, life returned. In her healing she brought forth new gods, each one born from the part she restored. From his jaw came Nanshi, goddess of justice and water. From his ribs came Ninti, the lady of life. From his eyes came Ninima, the goddess of writing and wisdom. From each wound a gift was born. Enki was healed, and in his healing, the world was enriched with new forms of order. The story of Enki's illness and Ninhursag's mercy is often read as a myth about balance, the endless negotiation between curiosity and caution, knowledge and reverence. Enki's hunger to understand led him to transgress, but his suffering brought forth new creation. Ninhursag's anger preserved the moral structure of the world, yet her forgiveness renewed it. Between them, the universe learned to breathe again. It is tempting to see in their story a reflection of humanity's own paradox, the constant push between invention and preservation. The Sumerians may not have spoken in those terms, but they understood that progress and peril are born of the same impulse. To know is to risk, and to create is to disturb. The goddess, in her wisdom, did not destroy Enki for his transgression. She transformed it into growth. That transformation became a sacred principle of existence. Every imbalance can yield renewal if tempered with compassion. Later generations would see this myth as the first description of moral order. Enki's curiosity was not condemned, but it required restraint. Ninhursag's wrath was not vengeance, but correction. Together they embodied the cycle of cause and restoration. In this sense, their story was not a punishment, but an education, for gods and humans alike. Archaeologists have found echoes of this divine experiment carved into the earlier Sumerian seals. Scenes show a seated goddess with flowing hair, holding a sprouting plant, while beside her a bearded figure, likely Enki, offers a vessel of water. Between them, a serpent winds upward around a stylized tree. To modern eyes, the image is startlingly familiar, almost a prelude to later tales of gardens, forbidden fruits, and knowledge that comes at a cost. Yet in the Sumerian version there is no fall, no exile, only balance regained. The union of Ninhursag and Enki was not romantic in the human sense, though some later hymns describe tenderness between them. It was creative union, the meeting of intellect and fertility, a continual dialogue between mind and matter. Their experiment was not limited to the making of humanity, but extended to the maintenance of the world itself. Each season, each flood, each harvest was a renewal of their cooperation. When the rains came at the right time and the crops ripened evenly, the priests said it was because the goddess and the god were once more in accord. The temple rituals reenacted this cosmic balance. At the great ziggurats of Eridu and Adab, priests poured libations of fresh water over altars of clay, symbolizing Enki's gift to the earth. In return, they offered baskets of grain and fruits to Ninhursag, acknowledging the soil's gratitude. These ceremonies were not mere superstition. They were the continuation of the divine experiment, the understanding that harmony must be tended, renewed, and remembered. The more one studies these ancient hymns, the clearer their underlying philosophy becomes. The gods were not imagined as perfect rulers, but as collaborators in the same fragile balance that sustained all life. Creation was not a static achievement. It was an ongoing process. The divine experiment was never complete. It was conducted anew each year, each season, each dawn. What makes the story enduring is its humanity, Enki's curiosity, Ninhursag's patience, their conflict and reconciliation, These are not distant divine dramas, but mirrors of experience. The Sumerians understood that wisdom without restraint leads to imbalance, and nurture without discernment leads to stagnation. The two must work together, each correcting the other. In that sense, the myth of Enki and Ninhursag is not about gods at all. It is about the human condition, the endless task of balancing reason with compassion, ambition with humility, creation with care. In the quiet aftermath of Enki's recovery, the world seemed to exhale. The waters flowed again, the fields flourished, and the sky regained its clear brilliance. The humans, unaware of the divine conflict that had nearly unmade them, continued their lives, planting, building, singing their simple songs to the gods who watched over them. Ninhursag returned to her mountains, but her presence lingered in the fertility of the land. Enki retreated to the Absu, but his wisdom continued to guide those who listened. Between them, the cycle of life resumed, stronger for what had been learned. The story ends not with triumph, but with understanding. The goddess and the god had tested the boundaries of creation and discovered that even perfection requires correction. Dilmun, the garden of purity, was no longer untouched, but it was alive in a new way. The plants still grew, but now they carried memory. The waters still flowed, but now they bore reflection. The world had matured, and with it so had its creators. It was said that Ninhursag often returned to the garden after that. She would walk among the plants that Enki had once eaten, touching their leaves with renewed care. Where once she had seen transgression, she now saw transformation. The plants were not diminished by his curiosity, they were enriched by it. Each one now held a story, a purpose, a lesson. She understood then that even mistakes could become sacred if met with compassion. The myth calls that moment the second creation, not of bodies, but of wisdom. The first had shaped the world, the second had taught it how to endure. The divine experiment was never about power. It was about learning how creation sustains itself through balance, through renewal, through forgiveness. When the priest recited the tale in the flicker of temple lamps, their voices were soft, their tone reverent. They were not recounting a myth of punishment or fall, but a meditation on interdependence. The gods had learned what every living being must learn, that to create is to be responsible, that knowledge carries weight, and that even the wisest must bow to the rhythm of the world they shape. And so, the Garden of Dilmun remained, untouched by time yet alive with memory. The goddess's hands continued their quiet work, moulding the soil, shaping the roots, reminding the earth that perfection is not the absence of error, but the presence of balance. The world was still young, still learning, still guided by the patient will of its mother and the curious mind of its maker. Far beneath them, in the depths of the Abzu, Enki's waters whispered against the stone, carrying the echo of their experiment. Above, in the mountains, Ninhursag's winds answered, steady and forgiving. Between them stretched the earth, the living proof of their collaboration, the ever-renewing outcome of their divine design. The experiment had not ended. It had only begun. The Garden of the Gods was quiet when it happened. The air hung warm over the plains, the rivers glowed like veins of silver, and the world seemed content to rest in the balance that Ninhursag and Enki had restored. The first humans already walked upon the land, tending crops and building small enclosures of reed and clay. They moved slowly, unsure, still learning the rhythm of their own existence. They could labour, they could listen, but they could not yet speak. Their lives were steady and silent, a mirror of the still earth from which they had come, and for a while that was enough. But silence cannot contain life forever. The same spark that had stirred them to rise from the soil now stirred them to expression. The gods who had shaped them from clay watched this quiet awakening with a mixture of curiosity and care. They had given the new beings form, endurance, and the capacity to work, but something within the design was beginning to change. The clay had learned not only to move, but to think. It would soon learn to speak. In the ancient Sumerian stories, the moment when humanity found its voice is not described as an accident. It is portrayed as a continuation of creation, another phase of the goddess's experiment. Ninhursag had always understood that life was not static. Every form she moulded carried within it the possibility of evolution. She knew that the beings she made would one day go beyond the purpose for which they were created. It was inevitable. The clay itself remembered the hands that shaped it, and in remembering, it desired to create in turn. The myths say that the first sounds came not from words, but from breath. The humans learned to hum as they worked, low rhythmic tones that followed the beat of the harvest and the flowing of water. These were not songs in the modern sense, but vibrations, instinctive expressions of effort and contentment. The gods listened, amused. To them, it sounded like the earth itself had begun to whisper. Over time, these hums became patterned, and the patterns became communication. The first language was born from rhythm before it was born from meaning. Enki was the first to notice. His curiosity, always alive, drew him closer to the humans he and Ninhursag had shaped. He watched them as they tended the soil, observed how they began to mimic the sounds of the animals and the flow of water. Their voices were rough, imperfect, but something remarkable was happening. Through imitation, they were creating symbols, a grunt for food, a murmur for water, a sigh for rest. Each sound carried intention, and intention was the foundation of thought. When Enki returned to Ninhursag and told her what he had witnessed, she was not surprised. She smiled quietly and said, "The clay remembers us. It will remember more." Her tone was neither fearful nor proud, merely observant, as though she had always known this would come. For her, creation was not control. It was permission. She had given the clay the ability to hold life. It was only natural that life would seek its own voice. The other gods were not so calm. Some were unsettled by what they saw. The beings who once moved like shadows now looked one another in the eye. They shared food, built shelters, and began to express joy and anger. The gift of voice had made them unpredictable. What if, the gods wondered, they forgot their makers? What if they learned to question? The divine assembly gathered to discuss the matter, and as always it was Enki and Ninhursag who stood at the centre of debate. Enlil, stern and authoritative, believed the humans should be limited. He saw in their growing consciousness a reflection of divine power, and worried it might challenge the order of heaven and earth. Enki argued otherwise. To him, intelligence was not a threat, but a necessity. If they are to serve, he said, they must understand. If they are to sustain the world, they must perceive it. His reasoning was not defiance, but logic. Knowledge was an extension of balance. Ninhursag, listening quietly, did not intervene. She understood both perspectives. But when the council fell into disagreement, she made her decision with the same calm certainty that had always defined her. "They are ours," she said. "Let them speak. Let them remember." The words silenced the hall. The decree was final. From that moment, humanity would no longer be bound by silence. The breath that had once animated clay was given voice. The power of speech spread through the early generations like fire across dry grass. What began as murmurs became structured utterance, and with it came the birth of naming. Naming was the first form of magic the Sumerians ever described. To name something was to recognize it, to separate it from the undifferentiated whole. The gods had names. Now so did the works of their hands. The humans named the rivers, the stars, the tools they made, and even the animals that wandered among them. Each name was a bridge between thought and matter. The clay, which had once been shaped, was now shaping its own world. Ninhursag observed this transformation with both pride and humility. Her creations were not defying her. They were fulfilling her purpose. The myths say she walked among them sometimes, disguised as one of their own, teaching them the simplest crafts. how to weave reeds into mats, how to store grain, how to calm a frightened child. In return, the humans built small shrines of clay to honour her. They called her Ninma, the exalted lady, or Mami, the mother. Her presence became woven into their daily lives, not as a distant deity, but as the memory of care itself. As language blossomed, so did thought. The people began to tell stories of their own. They spoke of the gods, yes, but also of the world around them. They described the river's moods, the behaviour of animals, the stars that wandered across the night. These were the first seeds of myth, humanity's own contribution to creation. Words gave them not only communication but continuity. Through language they could pass on knowledge, memory and emotion. What had once been instinct became culture. Enki, delighted by their progress, began to share with them fragments of his wisdom. He taught them how to measure water levels, how to build canals, how to use clay to make bricks. He showed them the geometry of the stars and how the moon's cycle could guide the seasons. To him, this was a continuation of Ninhursag's work, not rebellion, but collaboration. Each new discovery was another layer of balance added to the world. The gods were not losing control, they were expanding it through their children. But not all agreed. There were whispers among the divine assembly that humanity was becoming too clever, too independent. Some feared they would forget gratitude, that they would one day claim creation as their own. Others argued that this was inevitable, that the divine image reflected in human minds could not be erased. The debate, like so many before it, came down to one truth that Ninhursag understood better than anyone. Creation is irreversible. Once life begins to awaken, it cannot be unmade. It can only be guided. Her guidance was subtle, never forceful. She inspired rather than commanded. The people who lived near her sacred mountains began to develop rituals of fertility and renewal, acts of imitation that echoed her divine gestures. Each planting season was accompanied by chants that invoked her name, thanking her for the soil's patience. Women in childbirth whispered prayers to her, as the first humans once had whispered to one another. In these rituals, the distinction between divine and mortal blurred. She was not above them. She was among them. As the generations passed, language grew more refined. What had begun as sounds for need became words for wonder. People began to describe things that had no shape: love, fear, hope, memory. In those words they captured the invisible, much as Ninhursag had once shaped the invisible into form. The clay of humanity was speaking back to its maker. It was articulating the mystery of existence, one word at a time. The Sumerians later said that this was the true gift of the gods, not strength, not beauty, but expression. To speak was to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. When the first hymns were composed, they were addressed not just to the gods above, but to the soil itself, to the rivers, to the mountains. Every word was an offering, every sentence a thread between creator and creation. In one surviving hymn, the scribe wrote, "The people call, and the goddess hears. Their voices rise like the wind upon her mountain, and she smiles, for the clay has learned to speak." It is a simple line, but it carries the weight of the entire myth. For Ninhursag, language was not rebellion. It was proof that her design had worked. The being she made had inherited not only life but consciousness, the same consciousness that had once stirred within the gods. Of course, speech also brought consequence. With words came memory, and with memory came longing. The humans began to ask questions, not only about the earth, but about themselves. Why did they labour? Why did they die? Why were the gods distant? Their prayers, once purely grateful, began to carry the tone of curiosity, even complaint. Ninhursag heard it all, and though the myths do not describe her answers, they suggest she was not angered. To her, questions were the proof of intelligence. Even doubt was part of growth. The myths of this period reflect a subtle shift in the relationship between divine and mortal. Humanity was no longer simply an instrument of the gods, but a partner in the ongoing maintenance of the world. The people worked the fields not merely for offerings, but for survival. They built temples not as submission, but as gratitude. The gods in turn drew strength from the devotion of their creations. It was a cycle of mutual need. In the tablets, this is described as the breath of exchange. The prayers of humans rose to the heavens as vapour, and the blessings of the gods descended as rain. It was a poetic description of the hydrological cycle, yes, but also a moral one. The flow between divine and human was the same as the flow between sky and earth. Constant, reciprocal, and vital. If one ceased, the other would perish. As the power of language deepened, so did its danger. Words could heal, but they could also divide. The same tongue that sang praise could curse. The Sumerians understood this early, which is why they treated speech as sacred. To misuse it was to misuse creation itself. The priests who copied the oldest hymns often began their work with invocations to Ninhursag, asking her to bless their hands and steady their words. Every inscription was an act of reverence, a reminder that language was a living thing, a continuation of that first moment when clay drew breath. Over centuries, this reverence gave rise to the great oral traditions of Mesopotamia, the poems, hymns, and epics that preserved not only the deeds of gods but the emotions of people. And through it all, Ninhursag's presence endured quietly, like the soft hum beneath every melody. Her creation had found its voice, and in that voice she heard the echo of her own. The transformation was complete, yet it never truly ended. Humanity had learned to speak, but it would spend eternity learning to understand what it was saying. The goddess watched from her mountains as civilizations rose from the same soil she had shaped. The clay of her first design had built temples, laws, songs, and stories. It had become everything she'd imagined, and more. Somewhere in those cities of mud, brick, and stone, the people still moulded figures of her, small, rounded, patient forms pressed by hand and left to dry in the sun. They placed them on household altars, beside bowls of grain or lamps of oil, whispering thanks to the one who had given them not just life, but voice. The clay had spoken, and the world had begun to listen. And from that silence broken by sound, another transformation was already stirring. A test of the harmony between gods and their children, a moment when paradise would change forever under the shadow of divine consequence. There was once a place the ancients called Dilmun. To them it was not myth but memory, a land so perfect that the gods themselves called it home. It lay where the rivers met the sea, a place of endless light and gentle air untouched by decay. The tablets say that in Dilmun there was no sickness, no death, no sorrow. The old never grew weak, and the young never cried. The animals walked together in peace, and the waters that ran through its fields were so pure that even the gods drank from them. It was the paradise of beginnings, the reflection of creation before burden touched it. The Sumerians wrote of Dilmun as both a location and a state of being. Some believed it lay far to the south, near the mouth of the Persian Gulf, where the fresh waters of the Tigris and Euphrates mingled with the salt of the sea. Others thought it was beyond the horizon, a place that could not be reached by ship or caravan but only remembered in dreams. However it was conceived, the descriptions were the same. The land was green, the soil fertile, the light perpetual. It was the divine garden where the goddess Ninhursag and the god Enki walked side by side, watching over the young world they had made. For the early Sumerians, Dilmun was more than myth. It was the ideal of what the world might once have been, a living image of harmony between heaven and earth. It was not simply a reward for the dead or a promise for the faithful. It was a memory of balance, a time before suffering became part of life. To speak of Dilmun was to speak of how things were meant to be. In the surviving hymns, the garden is described with almost scientific precision. Its trees are heavy with fruit, its rivers are perfectly divided, Its air is warm but never stifling. There are no insects to sting, no diseases to wound, no storms to destroy. The gods lived there not as rulers, but as caretakers. The world outside might have been filled with labour and strife, but within Dilmun, every sound and scent spoke of peace. It was here that Ninhursag found her rest after the long labour of creation. She walked among the trees, her hands brushing the leaves that shimmered with morning dew. The clay that had once been lifeless now bloomed with endless vitality. She had made a world that could care for itself. The rivers, fed by the waters of Enki's Abzu, ran clear and gentle. The fields rippled like green silk under the constant sun. Everything was in balance. Enki too found joy in this place. To him, Dilmun was not merely paradise, but a living experiment, the perfect model of divine ecology. The irrigation channels, the cycles of growth, the unseen mechanisms that sustained it all, these were his masterpieces. The garden was proof that his wisdom and Ninhursag's nurture could coexist in harmony. Together they walked its paths, she touching each plant as if blessing it, he noting its form and structure, content in their shared accomplishment. But even in paradise, curiosity stirs. The myth tells that one day, as Enki wandered through the garden, he came upon a group of strange plants he had never seen before. They grew near the water's edge, their leaves a deeper green, their fragrance intoxicating. 7 in number, they stood apart from all others, and their beauty drew him closer. Each plant, the text says, carried within it a secret virtue, a power that could heal, strengthen, or enlighten. They were not meant to be touched. Ninhursag had placed them there as symbols of restraint, the living boundaries of divine order. But Enki, driven by the same curiosity that had once led him to create humanity, could not resist. He plucked their leaves, tasted their sap, and felt within himself the rush of hidden knowledge. The act was small, but its consequences were immense. In that moment the perfect balance of Dilmun trembled. The plants had been the anchors of harmony, their untouched presence ensuring that paradise remained inviolate. By consuming them, Enki had disturbed the equilibrium that held the world together. The garden remained beautiful, but something invisible had shifted, a ripple that would echo through every age to come. When Ninhursag discovered what he had done, her heart filled with sorrow. It was not anger that moved her, but the quiet grief of one who sees inevitability unfold. She knew that knowledge once taken could never be returned. The purity of Dilmun could not survive understanding. Paradise depended on innocence, and innocence had just been lost. The myth tells that she withdrew from the garden, retreating to the mountains that had always been her refuge. In her absence, Enki's body began to weaken. The divine harmony that bound them was broken. His organs failed one by one. His eyes clouded, his ribs ached, his heart faltered. The gods, panicked, sought her counsel, but she would not return. The world, for the first time, felt the weight of imbalance. Days passed, and the garden dimmed. The rivers no longer sang as before. The air grew heavy. Even the humans, though far away, sensed something had changed. They looked at the sky and saw the sun burn colder, the nights longer. It was as if creation itself was holding its breath, waiting for its mother to forgive. At last, one of the younger gods, Ninshubur, approached Ninhursag in her mountain temple. She pleaded for the world. "If you will not heal Enki," she said, "the waters will dry and all life will fade." Ninhursag, silent for a long while, finally rose. Her heart softened. Creation was not a thing she could abandon. She descended once more to Dilmun. Enki lay near the sacred pool, his skin pale, his breath shallow. The 7 plants he had eaten lay wilted beside him. Ninhursag knelt and placed her hand upon his chest. One by one she touched each afflicted part of his body, and with every touch she gave birth to a new healing deity, gods and goddesses who embodied restoration. From his jaw came Nanshi, who would bring justice to the rivers. From his ribs came Ninti, the lady of life. From his eyes came Ninima, the goddess of writing and remembrance. From each wound, balance was reborn. When she had finished, Enki's colour returned. He opened his eyes and saw her beside him. No words passed between them, only a quiet understanding. In his folly he had broken perfection, but in doing so he had allowed creation to evolve. The garden was no longer innocent, but it was alive in a new way. It had learned the rhythm of loss and renewal. To the Sumerians, this story explained something fundamental about existence, that perfection cannot endure. Life depends on change, and change requires imbalance. Dilmun's fall was not a tragedy, but a transformation. The beginning of the world as we know it. The paradise before pain gave way to the living earth, where growth and decay coexist, where joy and sorrow are bound together. Even so, the memory of Dilmun never faded. For centuries it lingered in the collective mind as the symbol of the world's original harmony. In every field that bloomed, people saw a reflection of that lost perfection. Every spring that flowed was a reminder that paradise still lived beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. The Sumerians believed that when the rains returned after drought, it was Ninhursag breathing life back into the earth, a small echo of her forgiveness in Dilmun. The temple hymns kept that memory alive. They spoke of the land where the raven does not croak, where the lion does not devour, where the wolf does not seize the lamb. To the faithful, these were not mere poetic images, but glimpses of what had once been. The rituals performed in her name were not attempts to recreate paradise, but to honour its memory, to remind humanity that balance, though fragile, could always be restored. Archaeologists still debate where Dilmun might have been. Some locate it in Bahrain, where ancient settlements sit upon freshwater springs rising from the sea. Others trace it to the coast of Kuwait or the island of Failaka, where ruins of temples and trade centres lie buried under sand. Perhaps it was all of these, or none. Perhaps Dilmun was never a place on a map, but a condition of harmony that humanity once knew instinctively and later forgot. The Sumerians did not ask where it was. They understood that paradise was not a location but a lesson. It was the reminder that the world began in balance and could, through wisdom and compassion, return to it. Ninhursag's forgiveness was not a single act but a cycle. The eternal readiness of creation to heal itself. The garden might have been lost, but its echo lived on in every river that found its way back to the sea. And so, even after the gods departed from Dilmun, its story endured. The priests recited it at planting festivals and during rituals of renewal. They spoke of how the goddess had once walked among them, of how her footsteps had left green trails across the earth. They believed that every act of birth, every new sprout from the soil, was her quiet return. The paradise before pain was not gone. It was hidden within life itself, waiting in every cycle of death and rebirth. When the night fell over ancient Sumer and the wind whispered through the reeds, people would look toward the southern horizon and imagine the soft gleam of Dilmun's waters. They believed that beyond that light lay a place where the gods still walked, where Ninhursag tended the eternal garden, and where the first clay figures, now forgotten by time, still stood, smiling faintly in the endless dawn. The world they knew was harsher, full of toil and impermanence, but somewhere in their hearts they carried the memory of that beginning. A time when the soil was sacred, when the rivers were gentle, and when the breath of a goddess had turned clay into life. In that memory they found comfort. In that story they found meaning. The paradise before pain was never truly lost. It was simply transformed into the endless work of living. The garden became the world. The gods' care became the hands of humanity. The experiment continued, under new names and new skies, and as the rivers flowed from the mountains into the sea, as the seasons turned without end, the voice of Ninhursag lingered in every wind that moved through the reeds, calm, forgiving, eternal. The peace that followed the days of Dilmun did not last forever. Even in the heavens, harmony is not eternal. The gods, though eternal in name, were not immune to fatigue. They had built the world with patience and care, but creation, as Ninhursag had always known, demands constant attention. The rivers must be kept within their bounds, the winds restrained, the balance between heat and water maintained. Every mountain that rose shifted the air, every storm that passed carried a consequence. To maintain that equilibrium was work, endless, unrelenting work. At first the gods performed it willingly. The world was still young, and their pride in its perfection was enough to sustain them. But the tasks multiplied. The rains that once fell gently began to flood. The rivers changed their paths, carving new channels across the plain. Forests thickened, deserts spread, and the sky itself grew restless. The divine labourers, those who managed the workings of the world, began to murmur. They were the younger gods, called the Igigi, whose hands shaped the natural order under the command of the higher deities. They dug the beds of rivers, measured the courses of stars, lifted the fertile soil and tended to the clouds. Their work was endless, their rest brief. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest stories of humanity's origin, begins here. Not with the making of man, but with the exhaustion of the divine. The Igigi had been working for many ages, building and maintaining the great canals that brought life to the lands below. Their sweat darkened the soil, their cries rose to the sky. The older gods, An, Enlil and Enki, watched from above, but the burden was not theirs to carry. For the younger ones, the paradise of creation had become a field of toil. It is said that after 40 years of labour, they could bear it no longer. They gathered secretly at night, their faces covered in dust, their hands still raw from the work. Their leader, one of the foremen of the heavens, spoke words that none had dared utter before. "Why do we, who are gods, toil like beasts? Let us rise and end this burden." The others listened in silence, then one by one nodded their assent. They threw down their spades and torches, setting fire to their tools. The flames rose against the night sky, visible even to the halls of the higher gods. When Enlil saw the firelight, he demanded to know who had dared defy divine order. The answer came with a sound that shook the world, the chant of the Igigi rising in unison, a roar of rebellion echoing across heaven and earth. Enlil's rage was swift. He summoned his council, and thunder rolled across the sky. But the other gods hesitated. The rebellion was not an act of malice, it was the cry of exhaustion. They had created a world so intricate that even divine strength was not enough to sustain it forever. Punishment, they realized, would not solve the problem. The burden of creation itself had become too heavy. Enki, calm as always, saw what must be done. "If the labour is too great for the gods," he said, "then let it be shared. Let another kind of being carry the load." It was not cruelty that inspired his suggestion, but necessity. The world could not endure without caretakers, and the gods could no longer bear that role alone. He turned to Ninhursag, the only one who could shape what he imagined. "You made the earth fertile," he said to her. "Can you not also make life that will tend it?" Ninhursag understood at once. She saw the truth in his words, but also the cost. To create life capable of toil meant to introduce mortality. Perfection could not bear such burden without breaking. The beings she would make would not be divine. They would need to grow, struggle, and die. Their lives would be shorter, their strength limited, but their endurance would surpass that of gods because it would be born from necessity. The other gods agreed, but they had no other choice. The rebellion of the Igigi had revealed the flaw in heaven's design. Creation required continuity, and continuity required new hands. Thus began the second great act of divine creation, not of paradise, but of survival. In the myths, this decision marks a turning point. Until then, creation had been pure, effortless. Now it became pragmatic. The gods mixed their divine essence with the clay of the Abzu, forming beings who would inherit both the Earth's resilience and the gods' awareness. But this new act of creation was not celebrated with song. It was done in weary silence, the quiet acceptance of beings who had learned that perfection is not sustainable. The rebellion of the Igigi became, in later generations, a story of empathy. It explained why humans work, why the world demands effort. The gods had passed down not just their gifts, but their weariness. The burden of creation was not punishment. It was inheritance. To live was to participate in the maintenance of the world. The rivers still needed tending, the crops still needed care. The difference now was that humanity had taken its place in the cycle. Ninhursag's role in this transformation was both tender and tragic. She shaped humanity not out of defiance but compassion. The labour of the gods had been divine in scale but not in endurance. Humans, born of clay, could endure because they could adapt. They were fragile yet infinitely resilient. Their mortality gave them urgency. Their weakness gave them wisdom. In the eyes of Ninhursag, that was balance, the continuation of the experiment she and Enki had begun. In one of the fragments of the Enuma Elish, there is a line that scholars often overlook. The gods rested when man arose. It is a short phrase, but it carries immense meaning. The creation of humanity was not the culmination of divine glory, but the relief of divine fatigue. The gods did not create man to rule him. They created man to survive themselves. The world was too vast, too alive to exist without constant care. Humanity became the bridge between divine intention and earthly necessity. For the people of Sumer, this story explained not only their origin, but their condition. Life was work. To farm, to build, to sustain one's family. These were not curses, but sacred duties, inherited from the gods themselves. The very act of labour was worship. Each swing of a hoe, each brick laid in mud, each jar filled with grain was a continuation of the divine effort. The gods had once struggled with the same tasks. The sweat of man was the echo of their rebellion. The temples that rose in the cities of Ur and Lagash reflected this belief. They were not places of leisure but of service. The priests who tended the altars did not see themselves as servants of distant deities, but as collaborators in creation. They maintained the sacred fires, managed the waters, and performed the rituals that mirrored the old divine labours. In their chants, they repeated the ancient rhythm: work, rest, renewal. To the Sumerians, this rhythm defined existence. There was no heaven free of effort, no paradise untouched by need. Even the gods depended on offerings and prayers to sustain their essence. In this worldview, dependence was not weakness but connection. Every being, mortal or divine, contributed to the stability of the whole. The rebellion of the Igigi had not broken creation, it had expanded it. Ninhursag, watching from her mountain sanctuaries, remained the quiet guardian of that balance. Her temples became known as the Ezagula, the womb houses, places where both gods and humans could seek renewal. Offerings of milk and honey were left for her, symbols of nourishment and endurance. The inscriptions carved into clay tablets called her the mother who restores the breath. Her followers did not pray for an end to labour, but for the strength to endure it. They understood that pain and effort were not curses, but elements of life's continuity. The gods themselves seemed to learn from their rebellion. They grew quieter, less prone to vanity. The myths of later ages portray them not as distant rulers, but as weary overseers, maintaining the world with subtle adjustments. Enki's wisdom became the blueprint of order. Ninhursag's patience became the foundation of life. Together they ensured that the world would continue to evolve, even if perfection was no longer possible. From the divine fatigue of that ancient revolt, humanity inherited something profound, the sense that effort gives meaning. The Sumerians saw their daily work not as drudgery, but as sacred mimicry of the gods' first labours. To dig a canal was to echo the work of the Igigi. To bake bread was to honour Ninhursag's nurturing touch. To rest after labour was to remember the day when even the gods had laid down their tools. In a way, this story contains the first theology of responsibility. It teaches that creation is not a single event but a shared process. The gods began it, but humanity continues it. The burden that once caused rebellion among the divine became the privilege of the mortal. To live was to sustain what the gods had built, to keep the world from falling back into chaos. Even the act of rebellion itself was not condemned. In the oldest tablets there is no language of sin or punishment. The revolt of the Igigi was treated as natural, a moment of correction within a larger balance. The gods did not destroy the rebels, they listened to them. They adjusted creation in response. The story carries a quiet wisdom that later civilizations would forget, that even protest has a place in the harmony of things. The universe, like the gods who made it, learns through fatigue, failure, and forgiveness. And so, the world moved forward. The gods returned to their places in the sky, their burdens eased. The humans took up the work of the earth, their hands guided by memory and necessity. The soil that had once been moulded by divine fingers now bore the imprints of human labour. The sweat of mortals watered the fields that had once been divine. The cycle continued, endless and alive. Sometimes, in the oldest hymns, one finds lines addressed not to the creator but to the worker. "Blessed are those who lift the earth," one tablet reads. "Blessed are those who feed the gods through the labour of their hands." It is a simple acknowledgement of the divine in the ordinary, that to sustain the world is the highest act of devotion. In the quiet of the temples, when the fires burned low and the priests recited the ancient names, they remembered the time before humanity, when even gods could tire. They remembered how creation had nearly halted, how the goddess had bent once more to the soil, shaping the future with compassion rather than command. They remembered that the burden of creation is not a punishment but a partnership, one that binds heaven and earth in eternal rhythm. The rebellion ended, but its lesson never faded. The world was no longer perfect, but it was balanced. The gods rested, and humanity began its long labour under the gaze of the mountains, watched always by the mother who had made them strong enough to endure. And as the wind moved through the reeds by the rivers of Sumer, the people believed they could still hear the echoes of that ancient uprising, not as a sound of anger, but as a whisper of life continuing, carrying the weight of the gods with patience, one breath at a time. When the rebellion of the gods had ended and the dust of their unrest had settled, the heavens were quiet again. The rivers of the earth ran slow and heavy, the plains shimmered in the sun, and the divine council gathered to consider what would come next. The burden of creation still remained. The gods, though eternal, had grown weary of their endless labour. The canals had to be dredged, the irrigation kept flowing, the fields tended. The younger gods had refused, the older ones had relented, and now the balance of the world demanded something new. In the silence that followed, Enki turned his gaze toward the earth. He saw the rivers winding through the clay, the fertile silt that glistened with life, and he thought of the goddess who had shaped so much before. Ninhursag, the mother of all, the lady of the mountain who could take dust and turn it into form, who could turn silence into breath. He knew the answer lay with her. It was she who had once moulded the clay into the first living forms, who had given shape to the creatures that moved across the plains and filled the waters of the earth. It would be she who could do it again, this time for the purpose of endurance. And so, the gods sent word to her. They called her from her mountain, and she descended through the clouds, her steps soft upon the wind. When she entered the council, the others fell silent. Enki spoke first. "The gods grow tired, Mother of the Earth," he said. "The work is too heavy. The rivers overflow, the fields cry out. We need hands that can labour without end." Ninhursag looked at him quietly, her eyes reflecting both compassion and understanding. "Hands that can labour," she repeated, "and hearts that can bear what even gods cannot." Her tone carried neither protest nor agreement, only awareness of what must follow. Enki unfolded his plan. From the clay of the Abzu, the sacred deep where the essence of creation still flowed, a new being could be formed, one not divine, yet capable of carrying divine intention. To this being they would give both the strength of the earth and a fragment of the god's own life force. The result would be a creature unlike any other, mortal in body, but touched by eternity in spirit. Ninhursag listened, her fingers tracing the grains of dust that drifted through the air. She knew the risk. To mix the divine with the mortal was to blur the boundaries of creation itself. Such beings would not be fully of heaven or of earth. They would live between both, inheriting the needs of the body and the desires of the soul. But without them, the world would falter. She agreed, and the work began. The ancient tablets describe what followed in language both clinical and sacred. The gods gathered in the Temple of Birth, a place of clay and water where creation was said to take shape. There, Ninhursag kneaded the clay from the Abzu, shaping it with care while Enki provided the design. He whispered formulas, recited patterns, described proportions, the divine mathematics of life. The mixture was alive with potential, heavy with water, pliant beneath her hands. But clay alone was not enough. It needed the spark of divinity, something that could move within it, something that could remember. Enki spoke of essence, of blood, of the divine substance that carried awareness. The gods debated among themselves which of them would sacrifice so that creation could live. In one version of the myth, it is the god Geshtu-i, whose name means ear or wisdom, who offers himself. He is slain, his blood mixed into the clay. In another version, Enki himself contributes his essence, allowing his life force to flow into the new beings. However it was told, the idea was the same: consciousness born of sacrifice. The Sumerians understood this not as cruelty, but as necessity. Life, they believed, required exchange. The gods gave a part of themselves so that creation could continue. It was a law as old as the world. Nothing comes into being without something being given. The blood of the divine became the inheritance of humanity, the spark that set the clay in motion, the echo of eternity within the limits of flesh. When the mixture was ready, Ninhursag shaped it carefully, forming figures that mirrored the gods in structure but not in grandeur. She made them with hands and feet, with eyes to see and lungs to breathe. Into their chests she pressed the sign of life, the imprint of her own touch. Around her, the other gods watched in silence. The air was heavy with anticipation. Then, one by one, she placed her creations upon the ground. The myths say that at first they were still. The clay held its shape, the forms were perfect, but they did not yet move. Enki stepped forward and whispered a word, one lost to time, and the goddess leaned close to the figures. She breathed upon their faces, her breath soft and steady as morning wind over the fields. The clay trembled, the eyes opened, the lungs drew air for the first time, and in that breath, humanity was born. The first people stood uncertainly, their movements slow, their eyes wide with wonder. They looked around as though seeing the world through the gaze of newborn gods. They did not speak, not yet, but their faces glowed with understanding. They recognized the earth beneath them, the rivers beside them, the stars above them. They were aware, not merely alive but awake. Ninhursag watched them with quiet pride. Enki smiled, though his eyes carried the weight of knowledge. He knew that in creating them, they had begun a new chapter in the story of existence, one that neither gods nor mortals could fully control. These beings were designed for labour, but they carried within them the seed of divinity. They would learn, they would imagine, they would question. The world would never be the same. The gods instructed them in the ways of the earth. They taught them how to till the soil, how to gather grain, how to build dwellings from mud and reed. The humans learned quickly, their hands steady, their minds sharp. They became the caretakers of creation, fulfilling the purpose for which they were made. The gods rested, their burden lifted. But rest, like perfection, never lasts. As generations passed, the humans multiplied. They worked the fields, offered tribute to the gods, and filled the earth with their voices. The divine experiment seemed to succeed. Yet the gods began to notice something unexpected. The humans were not merely following orders, they were adapting, inventing. They discovered new ways to cultivate, new tools to shape their environment. They built cities, formed languages, created stories. They were not just living, they were thinking. This, to some gods, was a sign of imbalance. "They are too clever," Enlil warned. "They have too much of us in them." But Ninhursag only smiled. "That is their nature," she said. "The clay remembers." For her, humanity's curiosity was not rebellion but continuity. The gods had shaped them in their image. It was natural they would reflect the divine impulse to create. Yet in this reflection lay the first tension between heaven and earth, the quiet awareness that the creation might one day rival the creator. The blood of the gods that ran through human veins carried both strength and fragility. It gave them intelligence but also desire, awareness but also longing. They could understand beauty, but they could also feel loss. They could imagine eternity but were bound by time. The very spark that animated them also made them restless. In this restlessness, the Sumerians found the origin of the human soul. One of the oldest tablets contains a line that seems almost modern in its melancholy. "The god's flesh is in us, and it remembers home." It was their way of explaining why humanity dreams, why the mind reaches beyond what the hands can touch. The divine blood made humanity yearn for something it could never fully return to. The gift of life came with the ache of separation. Ninhursag understood this sorrow better than any. She had seen it from the beginning, when she pressed her fingers into the clay and felt it pulse beneath her touch. Creation was not just making, it was dividing. Every birth was also a departure. The humans she had shaped were her children, yet they were also the inheritors of divine responsibility. Their pain would mirror that of the gods, the endless tension between freedom and duty, between joy and burden. The Sumerians turned that understanding into ritual. They saw in blood the symbol of connection, the thread between the seen and the unseen. In every sacrifice, in every offering of wine or grain, they honoured the exchange that had made life possible. They did not sacrifice to appease wrath, but to renew balance. To spill a drop of wine upon the earth was to remember the blood that had once mixed with clay. The breath that had animated the first humans also became sacred. In the Sumerian tongue, the word for breath, Z, meant both life and spirit. To breathe was to participate in the act of creation. Each inhalation was a remembrance of the goddess's first breath over the clay. The priests of Ninhursag began their prayers by drawing slow, deep breaths, aligning themselves with that primordial rhythm. They taught that to breathe consciously was to honour the goddess, to acknowledge that every living moment is sustained by her gift. The design of humanity, therefore, was more than physical. It was spiritual architecture. The body was clay, the blood divine, the breath eternal. The combination made humanity the bridge between worlds. They were creatures of matter and memory, of earth and sky. Their existence was both humble and holy, fragile in body, limitless in thought. Enki, ever the observer, watched as his creation flourished and multiplied. He saw their intelligence blossom, their ingenuity unfold. Sometimes he guided them in dreams, whispering ideas of irrigation, architecture, and writing. Sometimes he withdrew, letting them discover for themselves. He treated humanity not as servants but as collaborators, the continuation of his and Ninhursag's design. In contrast, Enlil saw in them the reflection of divine imperfection. He feared that their growth would one day disrupt the balance of heaven and earth. He was not entirely wrong. The humans, inheriting both divine wisdom and mortal hunger, would someday create beyond what even their gods had imagined. But for now, in the early age of their making, they were content. They worked, they built, they sang. Their hands carried the memory of divine touch. Their breath carried the rhythm of the goddess's heart. Ninhursag watched them from afar, from the highlands where the clouds touched the peaks. To her, each human birth was a repetition of that first act of creation, a moment when clay took breath again. In every newborn cry, she heard the echo of her own, the sound of life entering form. The people left offerings for her in the fields, simple tokens of gratitude, a handful of grain, a cup of water, a whisper into the wind. And in those gestures the cycle continued, creation honouring its creator through the very act of living. The story of blood and breath, of clay and consciousness, became the foundation of how the Sumerians understood themselves. They were not accidents of nature, but deliberate participants in a divine experiment. Their labour was sacred, their mortality meaningful. The gods had made them from need, but Ninhursag had made them from love. She gave them not only the ability to survive, but the desire to seek purpose, and perhaps that was her greatest gift. Not the clay that formed their bodies or the blood that quickened them, but the quiet impulse to look upward, to wonder why. The same breath that filled their lungs also filled their thoughts with questions. And in those questions the divine experiment continued, never ending, always evolving. In the end, the gods found rest, and the humans found meaning. The burden of creation had been shared, transformed into the rhythm of life itself. The clay of the earth carried divine memory, the blood carried divine essence, and the breath carried divine awareness. Together, they formed the pattern of all existence, and as the winds of Sumer brushed across the plains, carrying the scent of wet soil and river reeds, the people would sometimes pause in their labour, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath their feet, and whisper quietly, "We remember." For a long time, the world thrived. The rivers flowed where they should, the crops rose in perfect rhythm with the seasons, and the people, moulded from clay and divine breath, filled the earth with the sound of life. Their hands shaped cities, their words shaped stories, and their offerings to the gods kept the heavens steady. It seemed that the divine experiment had succeeded beyond all hope. But nothing born of creation remains still forever. Growth carries weight. Life multiplies, and with abundance comes imbalance. The same divine spark that had lifted clay into consciousness now began to stir in ways even the gods had not foreseen. The first signs were subtle. The humans grew numerous. Their fields expanded, their fires spread. Their voices rose like an unending hum beneath the sky. They prayed, they sang, they worked, and the world responded. The air thickened with smoke from cooking fires, the rivers ran slower from overuse, the nights were never truly silent. For the gods, who had once delighted in the harmony of sound and silence, it became a constant reminder of their creation's success and its consequence. Enlil, the Lord of the Winds, was the first to speak what others had only thought. "They are too many," he said. "Their noise disturbs our rest. Their breath clouds the sky." He was not cruel by nature, but order was his law, and order depends on distance. The divine should remain distinct from the mortal. Yet now the lines had begun to blur. The humans no longer lived as mere caretakers of the earth. They lived as masters of it. Ninhursag, hearing his words, remained silent for a time. She had watched the same expansion, the same restless hunger in her creations, But where Enlil saw intrusion, she saw life fulfilling its promise. The clay had learned to build, the breath to dream, the blood to persist. To her, this was not corruption, it was continuation. Still, even she could sense the imbalance growing. Humanity was changing the rhythm of the world. Enki, ever the mediator, tried to soothe the tension. "Let them be," he said. "Their clamour is the music of the living. Did we not create them to sustain the world? If they thrive, the world thrives with them." But his calm logic only deepened Enlil's unease. "And when the world overflows?" Enlil asked. "When their greed consumes the fields, when they forget who made them? Will you still call it music then?" The council of the gods divided. Some sided with Enlil, fearing that humanity's ambition would undo creation itself. Others stood with Enki, believing that freedom was the proof of divine design. And between them sat Ninhursag, the mother of both gods and mortals, burdened by the knowledge that neither side was wrong. She had made life to endure, but endurance itself could turn against balance. The myths speak of her sorrow in that time. She wandered the earth, unseen, moving through the fields and villages that had once been bare ground. She watched her children at work and at rest, saw their joy, their cruelty, their tenderness, their pride. They were reflections of the gods. Each act of kindness mirrored her touch. Each act of violence echoed divine conflict. Humanity was no longer an imitation. It was a continuation. And that realization both humbled and frightened her. There is an old text, preserved only in fragments, that describes how she sat beside a river one evening, watching a group of people draw water. The air was filled with laughter and the splash of clay jars. They did not know she was there. She saw in them everything she had hoped for: strength, cooperation, awareness. Yet when two of them began to quarrel, shouting and striking, she turned her face away. The same hands that could build could also harm. The same voice that could pray could also curse. Her creation had learned not only life but choice. Choice was what separated mortals from all other creatures. It was what made them divine and dangerous. Ninhursag understood that she could not unmake what she had started. To intervene would be to destroy the very essence of free will. So she chose patience, the hardest of divine virtues. She withdrew to her mountain temple and waited, trusting that the rhythm of life would eventually restore itself. But balance did not return. Humanity's numbers grew, and their works multiplied. The offerings to the gods became less sincere, more mechanical. The old rituals turned into habit, the sacred into transaction. People prayed for wealth, for victory, for rain, but few remembered gratitude. Enlil's warnings began to seem prophetic. The earth trembled under the weight of its caretakers. The great floods that came after were said to be the gods' response, though the stories differ in their tone. In some, the flood was punishment. In others, a desperate attempt to cleanse imbalance. In all, Ninhursag stands apart, saddened, reluctant, but understanding that even mercy can demand destruction. She had given life, but now life was consuming itself. The rivers that once nourished the fields rose and swallowed them. The cities that had honoured the gods vanished beneath water and silt. The people cried out, their voices rising to the heavens. Some begged for forgiveness, others cursed their makers. The flood did not distinguish between the faithful and the faithless. It was the return of silence after too much noise, the rebalancing of breath itself. And in that silence, Ninhursag wept. When the waters receded, the world was empty again. The few who survived stood amid the ruins, dazed and shivering. The fields were gone, the temples crumbled, the air heavy with salt and memory. The gods had withdrawn to their distant abodes, but Ninhursag remained. She moved quietly among the survivors, unseen, tending to the wounded, teaching them once more how to plant, how to rebuild, how to remember. She did not speak of punishment or sin. She spoke only of renewal. The flood became a turning point in the myths, Not the end of humanity, but its humbling. The people learned that even divine gifts have boundaries. They understood that life, though sacred, must be tended with care. The goddess's patience had not been in vain. Her creation, tested by loss, began to grow again, slower but wiser. In time, the world regained its rhythm. The rivers found new courses, the fields flourished once more, and new cities rose from the mud of the old. The gods resumed their distant watch, yet Ninhursag's heart carried the weight of what had passed. She had seen her creation destroy itself and begin again. She had learned that motherhood, even divine motherhood, means letting go. The Sumerians saw in her not a goddess of perfection, but of endurance. Her temples were not adorned with grandeur, but with simplicity, symbols of life's persistence. Offerings to her were often small, a bit of bread, a pinch of grain, a cup of milk. The people did not ask her for miracles, they asked her for strength. In her story they saw their own, the struggle to build, to fail, to rebuild again. Her trial was not a punishment for error, but the realization that creation, once given freedom, will always test its limits. To create is to accept that one day what you make will act on its own, perhaps even against you. The Sumerians understood the truth long before it was written in other tongues. They knew that every act of making carries the shadow of loss. The Mother Goddess bore that knowledge in silence. In later hymns they wrote of her sitting upon her mountain, gazing over the plains where her children lived. Her face was serene, but her eyes carried both pride and sorrow. She did not interfere when they quarrelled, nor when they prospered. Her power was not in control, but in constancy. She remained as the earth remained, patient, enduring, forgiving. It is said that sometimes, when the wind swept over the fields at dusk, the farmers could hear her voice in the rustling of the barley, whispering, "Do not forget who you are." They took those words to mean many things, that they were children of clay, that they were caretakers of the world, that their lives were part of a larger balance. Each interpretation was true. Through her trials, Ninhursag became more than creator. She became the memory of creation itself. She was the one who watched without judgment, who mourned without despair. She embodied the truth that life continues, even when it falters. The flood may have erased the old world, but through her a new one always rose. And so, as the centuries passed, her story softened into myth and her name into prayer. The people no longer saw her walking among them, but they felt her presence in the soil and the rain, in every act of endurance. The earth itself became her temple. The clay that once carried her breath now carried theirs. The world she'd shaped was no longer hers to command, but it still bore her touch. The goddess had faced her greatest trial and understood its lesson. Creation cannot be perfect because life cannot be still. Every age must learn, fall, and begin again. Her burden was not in the making of mankind, but in letting mankind exist as it was meant to, free, flawed, and endlessly becoming. And somewhere, deep in the rhythm of that freedom, her spirit still moved, the quiet heartbeat beneath all things, the reminder that even when creation turns against itself, the Mother waits, patient, ready to begin anew. When the floodwaters had long receded, and the world found its balance again, the people began to remember. They looked upon the earth not as a burden, but as a gift that demanded care. The rivers that once destroyed their homes now fed their crops, and the soil, rich with silt and memory, brought life to every seed they planted. Humanity had endured its first reckoning, and with endurance came gratitude. Out of that gratitude rose the first temples. They were not grand at first. The earliest were simple enclosures made of reeds and clay, shaped by hands that still trembled from loss. People gathered in them to give thanks for survival. They brought offerings of grain, fruit, and milk, not to appease wrath, but to honour the one who had never abandoned them. They did not yet have written hymns, but they had memory, and that was enough. They spoke her name softly: Ninhursag, Ninma, Nintu, Mami, the mother. The names changed from one city to another, but the reverence remained the same. The Sumerians believed that the first temple was not built for kings or priests, but for her, the one who had shaped the first breath. It stood on a small rise above the floodplain, facing the sunrise. There, the people placed clay figurines of women with broad hips and kind faces, symbols of fertility, nourishment, and continuity. Each was moulded by hand, no two alike. To make one was to imitate the goddess herself, to participate in creation once more. As generations passed, those small shrines grew into something larger. The people learned to shape mud brick, to fire clay, to raise walls that could last through storms. They built ziggurats, tiered mountains of stone and earth that reached toward the sky, as if returning the memory of Ninhursag's own mountains to the plains. Each level represented a stage of creation: earth, sky, heaven. At the summit stood a small room, open to the stars, where the priest would place her image. There the air was quiet, and the scent of burning cedar drifted upward like a prayer. In the city of Adab, the ruins of one such temple still whisper her name. Archaeologists found clay tablets there inscribed with hymns to the mother who restores the breath. The walls once bore carvings of rivers flowing from her hands and plants sprouting at her feet. Her image was not one of power, but of sustenance. She was shown seated, calm, her hands open, not commanding but giving. Every stone carried meaning. The foundations symbolized the womb of the earth. The stairways echoed the connection between heaven and soil. The temples were not meant to separate the divine from the human, but to remind both of their shared origin. When the people entered these sacred places, they were not approaching a distant god. They were returning to their source. In the oldest hymns, priests would recite, "You are the womb of the world, the clay beneath our feet, the breath within our chest. We build so that you may dwell among us as we dwell within you." These words were not written for grandeur, but for belonging. To them, worship was not submission, it was remembrance. The rituals held in her honour were gentle, domestic in nature. Women brought offerings of milk, symbol of life's continuity. Farmers carried baskets of the first harvest. Potters offered their finest vessels, shaped from the same clay the goddess had once moulded. Even the act of mixing water and earth was sacred, for it mirrored the moment of creation. Each time a potter's wheel turned, it was said that Ninhursag smiled. The priests of her temples were often midwives and healers, those who worked closest to the boundary between life and death. They carried her symbols, the sprouting plant, the open hand, the flowing river. Their chants were not of fear, but of renewal. They believed that every illness, every sorrow, was a temporary imbalance that could be healed by returning to her rhythm, the same rhythm that governed the tides, the growth of crops, and the breath of living beings. In one of the greatest cities of Sumer, her presence lingered in the architecture itself. The ziggurat there, though later dedicated to other gods, was said to have once belonged to her. Its tiers mirrored the mountains from which she descended, and its bricks were stamped with prayers to the mother of the land. Pilgrims climbed its steps not to seek miracles but to feel closeness, to stand where earth met sky and remember that both had once been part of her body. Over time, her image evolved. In the hands of different peoples, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, she became known by other names: Aruru, Belet Ili, Ki, or simply the earth itself. But her essence remained. Every time a new temple was built, every time a statue was carved, her story was retold. The details shifted, but the memory persisted. She was the soil that never forgot the touch of divine fingers. Even the stones themselves seemed to remember her. The temples were designed not only as places of worship, but as instruments of harmony. Their dimensions followed celestial patterns, their corners aligned with the rising of certain stars. The architects believed that by doing so, They could synchronize the human world with the order of heaven, the same balance Ninhursag had embodied. To build in her name was to participate in her wisdom. Some of these temples had special chambers known as Asagila, the womb houses. Within them, rituals of birth and renewal were performed. Women who hoped for children came there to pray, to be anointed with oil and water. The priests invoked the goddess's name, asking her to breathe life into the waiting womb, as she once breathed into clay. The walls of those rooms were decorated with carvings of reeds and flowing water, symbols of fertility and the gentle passage of life. Centuries later, when empires rose and fell, those sacred places were rebuilt again and again. Even when her name was forgotten, her form endured. The goddesses that followed, Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, even the later echoes of Earth Mothers in other lands, all carried fragments of her. The symbols remained the same: the womb, the mountain, the tree, the river. Wherever humans built in stone, they carried her memory in their architecture. To walk through the ruins of those temples today is to feel her presence still. The wind that moves through the broken walls hums softly, as though echoing the chants of long-dead priests. The patterns carved into the brick still reflect the same spirals of growth and renewal. Each line of cuneiform still holds her name in the language of the gods. The clay tablets, once pressed by human hands, now lie silent beneath the dust, but even in silence they speak. Archaeologists uncover them with brushes and light, reading the words that once rose to her altar. "You are the mother of mountains," one inscription says. "You are the birth giver, the one who restores what is lost. Without you, the rivers dry, the fields sleep, and the hearts of men forget how to hope." These were not prayers to prevent disaster, but reminders of gratitude. To honour her was to acknowledge that life persists through care, not conquest. The temples were not only for worship but for instruction. They were places where people learned the practical arts: farming, medicine, writing. To the Sumerians, knowledge itself was sacred, an extension of divine creation. To teach was to imitate Ninhursag, who had taught humanity how to survive after the flood. The schools of scribes that grew beside the temples were called houses of tablets, but in spirit they were houses of memory. Each tablet copied, each sign pressed into clay, was a continuation of the goddess's first creative act. Through these acts, the people believed they were maintaining the harmony she had established. The temple was not a boundary between human and divine, but a bridge between them. To step inside was to enter the memory of the world, to become part of the story that began when clay learned to breathe. Even when wars swept through the land and new gods claimed dominion, her essence endured quietly beneath their names. In every field ploughed, in every brick laid, her pattern remained. The earth itself was her temple, and humanity her ongoing hymn. For the people of Sumer, stone was not silence. It was a vessel of memory. Each wall, each tablet, each carved line was an echo of her hands shaping the first forms. The temples that rose from the plains were not monuments to power, but to continuity. They told a story older than kings, older than written words. The story of a mother who never left, who watched her children learn, stumble, and rise again. And though time has buried most of her temples, the feeling of her presence lingers wherever earth meets sky, wherever human hands shape clay. The memory of her creation lives in every act of making, in the craftsman smoothing a pot, the farmer pressing seed into soil, the builder stacking stone upon stone. Each gesture repeats her first wordless prayer to the world, that life should endure. When the sun sets over the ruins and shadows stretch across the ancient bricks, it is easy to imagine that she is still there, her voice moving through the wind, her patience carved into every layer of stone. She no longer needs temples to be remembered. The earth itself carries her memory, and in that, her work is complete. There comes a time in every civilization when the gods begin to change, not because they die, but because the people who name them do. Their temples fade, their languages shift, and their stories are told again in new tongues, by new hands. Yet beneath those changes, something ancient endures. The essence of the Divine Mother, the patient force that births, sustains and forgives, never disappears. It simply takes on new forms. Ninhursag was one of the first to embody that force. In Sumer, she was the Lady of the Mountain, the womb of creation, the one who shaped life from clay. For centuries she was worshipped as the origin of all things that grow and breathe. But as cities expanded and empires replaced one another, her image began to shift. What had once been a clear figure, a goddess who moulded humanity with her own hands, became something larger, more abstract, more universal. In the dawn of the Akkadian Age, when Sumer's language gave way to new rulers and new words, her name began to change. She became known as Ki, the personification of the earth itself. In that transformation, her individuality softened, but her presence deepened. She was no longer just the mother of humanity. She was the living world beneath their feet. Her temple still stood, her rituals still echoed, but she was now the ground, the fertility, the endless rhythm of creation that could not be confined to a single name. It was not an erasure, but an expansion. The people who came after the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, did not forget her. They absorbed her into their own pantheons. She was Aruru, the goddess who fashioned Enkidu from clay in the Epic of Gilgamesh, repeating the same ancient act of creation that she had once performed at the dawn of time. She was Belet Ili, the Lady of Birth, invoked by midwives and mothers across Mesopotamia. She was Nintu, the birth giver, the one who restores life after every loss. Her name's changed, but her essence, the nurturing balance between creation and care, remained the same. Every age spoke of her in its own way. When new gods rose to prominence, gods of storm, war, and law, her voice grew softer, but it never vanished. She became the steady undercurrent beneath the noise of history, the quiet foundation upon which every belief was built. When the priest recited hymns to Ishtar or Inanna, the goddesses of power and passion, they often began with invocations to the ancient mother who gave them birth. That mother was Ninhursag, even if her name was no longer spoken. In this transformation, something profound occurred. The goddess who had once shaped the first humans with her own hands became the archetype of the earth itself, self-renewing, enduring, silent. The personal became planetary. The myth became the metaphor. The clay she had moulded became the clay that sustained all life. Every seed pressed into the soil, every birth, every dawn repeated her gesture. The Babylonians saw her reflection in the figure of Tiamat, the primordial mother of the waters. Though later stories would paint Tiamat as chaos, the older understanding was more nuanced. She was not evil, but untamed, the raw power from which all order emerged. The gods did not destroy her. They organized her body into the structure of the world. It was another retelling of the same truth, creation through transformation, order born from the womb of the earth. As centuries turned, the shape of faith continued to change. New rulers, new languages, new empires rose and fell over the same plains that had once sung her hymns. The temples to Ninhursag crumbled, their bricks scattered by wind and flood. Yet her memory survived in ways the builders could never have predicted. Through the soil, through the stories, through the simple rhythm of life continuing. When the Greeks looked eastward and heard of ancient goddesses who birthed the world, they told their own versions. Gaia, the Earth Mother, rose from chaos to give form to heaven and land. Her strength and patience mirrored Ninhursag's. The idea that the planet itself could be divine, that the earth was not dead matter but a living being, was the echo of the old Sumerian faith. The language had changed, but the intuition remained, that creation was not a single act but an ongoing pulse. Even far beyond Mesopotamia, the image of the nurturing goddess endured. In the Indus Valley, figures of wide-hipped mothers made of terracotta bore the same gestures as the Sumerian figurines. The same folded hands, the same calm expression, the same quiet power. Across continents, without ever knowing one another, people seem to recall her. The idea of a mother who sustains the world was not born in one culture. It was carried in the memory of all who touched the earth and called it home. For the people who inherited the remnants of Mesopotamia, Ninhursag's story became one of identity. The farmers of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys continued to honour the fertility of the land long after her temples had turned to dust. Each year, as the floodwaters receded and the first sprouts appeared, they held festivals for the earth, for its patience, its generosity, its rebirth. The prayers no longer mentioned her name, but the rhythm of their gratitude was still hers. When later empires carved their myths into stone, they borrowed from her image. The goddess seated upon a throne holding a vessel of life became a motif across ages. From the basalt steles of Babylon to the marble reliefs of Greece to the frescoes of Rome. Even as her name faded, her posture endured. Every depiction of a nurturing mother cradling creation was a faint remembrance of the mountain goddess who had once breathed life into clay. Over time, the sacred became symbolic, and the myth became philosophy. Scholars and scribes began to speak of the world itself as a body. The rivers its veins, the mountains its bones, the air its breath. They believed that to harm the earth was to wound the divine, and to heal it was to honour her. That belief, though buried beneath centuries of changing faiths, has never completely disappeared. It lingers still in the way people speak of the planet, as mother, as home, as something alive. Ninhursag's transformation into Mother Earth was not a loss of power, but a diffusion of it. She ceased to be one figure among many, and became the quiet totality of existence. No longer invoked in temples, she was felt in the soil itself. No longer worshipped by name, she was remembered in instinct, in the reverence people feel for the land, the awe they feel before the natural world, the humility that comes from recognizing their dependence on it. The Sumerians might have said that her body had expanded to fill the world, that every mountain was her shoulder, every river her breath, every field her skin. The people who tilled the earth were not simply farmers, but caretakers of her being. The act of living became an act of devotion. And yet, through all the centuries of change, her oldest symbols remain the same: the tree of life, the mother with outstretched hands, the mountain rising from the plain. These images reappeared in every new faith, as if humanity could not forget her completely. The old stories of the clay and the divine breath survived in traces, in myths of gods forming man from dust, in tales of gardens where creation began, in whispers of a mother who once shaped the world with tenderness instead of force. Even now, when the languages of Sumer have long fallen silent, the feeling of her still exists. It lives in the way people touch the soil before planting, in the gratitude offered for rain, in the quiet moments when they look at the horizon and feel something older than themselves. That instinct, to see the sacred in the earth, to feel the mother in the matter, is her legacy. The transformation of Ninhursag was never a disappearance. It was a return to the essence of what she had always been, the balance between strength and gentleness, creation and patience, giving and enduring. She became not a forgotten goddess, but the unnamed spirit that flows through all life, the same force that whispers through fields at dusk, that turns stone to soil, that carries the memory of the first breath ever given. In the end, the people no longer needed to build temples for her, because the world itself had become her temple. The earth she once shaped now bore her face. The stories they told of her had turned into the air they breathed, and in that transformation, the goddess achieved what no monument ever could. She became eternal not through worship, but through existence itself. When the old temples fell silent and the languages that had once sung the names of the gods were forgotten, the stories themselves did not die. They changed shape, shifting from words to symbols, from rituals to memories, From stone to silence, the myths became whispers carried through time, fragments of something older than language, echoes of knowledge that had once bound heaven and earth together. In their poetry, beneath the veil of allegory, there lingers something that feels like understanding. The sense that the gods did not only create life, but knew the mechanisms by which life could be sustained. The Sumerians never separated science from divinity. To them, the study of the world was not an act of rebellion against the gods, but a form of worship. The cycles of the moon, the flooding of the rivers, the pattern of stars, all were seen as manifestations of sacred order. To understand them was to draw closer to the divine. Enki was the keeper of that knowledge, the one who mapped the flow of the Abzu, the hidden waters beneath the earth. Ninhursag, his counterpart, embodied that knowledge in form, turning theory into life. Together they represented a union of insight and creation, the first marriage of observation and application. When later generations wrote of the gods shaping humanity from clay, they were not describing a miracle in defiance of nature. They were expressing a truth they could not yet measure, that life comes from matter, that consciousness arises from structure. The mixing of divine blood and earth, of water and clay, is both mythic and profoundly literal. The ancient people knew that the body was of the earth and the spirit of something finer. The act of blending the two was a way to describe what today might be called transformation, the process by which the elements of the world combine into living form. In their myths, the gods were engineers as much as deities. Enki's Abzu was not only a spiritual realm, but a deep reservoir, a network of subterranean waters that sustained the fertility of the land. The texts describe him controlling its flow through gates, channels and locks, a system not unlike irrigation. The divine decrees, or me, that he distributed to the gods and kings were said to govern every aspect of civilization: writing, law, music, architecture, healing. To possess one was to hold a piece of divine science, a law of order that could sustain life and knowledge. Ninhursag's role in this system was equally vital. She was not a passive mother, but an active participant in the design of the world. The tablets speak of her measuring the clay, of drawing the form of the womb, of weighing the seed and water. The language is symbolic, but its precision is unmistakable. It describes process, calculation, proportion, balance. Her acts of creation were not chaos, but method. The myths preserve her as a figure of intuition guided by structure, of artistry guided by principle. Across thousands of years, these images remained. When the Babylonians inherited the old Sumerian tablets, they did not erase this view, they expanded it. Their priests were astronomers and mathematicians. Their temples were observatories as well as places of worship. They measured the sky with the same devotion their ancestors had once offered to the gods. They traced the motions of the planets and found patterns that repeated with perfect order. To them, that order was the language of creation, the handwriting of the divine. Even the ziggurats, those vast step towers that rose above the plains, were built according to precise alignments. The corners pointed toward cardinal directions, the levels corresponded to celestial spheres, and their heights followed mathematical ratios. The structure itself was a reflection of cosmic architecture, a bridge between heaven and earth. Within them, rituals of renewal were performed not to invoke supernatural power, but to reaffirm the harmony between the seen and unseen, the measurable and the mysterious. The Sumerians believed that to live well was to live in tune with the order of the gods. That order was not arbitrary. It could be studied, understood, and applied. The priests who served in Ninhursag's temples were not only caretakers of faith, but custodians of knowledge. They recorded observations of crops, weather, and celestial cycles. They learned when to plant by watching the stars. They knew that the flooding of the rivers followed the rhythm of the moon. They knew that the pulse of life was a pattern, and patterns could be learned. Over time, as writing evolved, that sacred knowledge was recorded in cuneiform, wedges pressed into clay. Some tablets contained hymns, others contained numbers. To the modern eye, they seem separate, one poetic, one practical. But to the ancients, they were the same. To count was to praise the gods. To measure was to imitate them. In the precision of numbers, they found divinity. In the beauty of poetry, they found truth. In this union of reverence and reason lies what could be called the forgotten science of the gods. Not a lost technology of machines and metal, but a way of seeing the world as inherently connected. The divine was not something apart from nature. It was the pattern within it. Ninhursag and Enki embodied that unity. She was the physical manifestation of life. He was its blueprint. When they created humanity, they were not merely shaping flesh, but transmitting understanding, embedding in human consciousness the same impulse to observe, create and preserve balance. That inheritance never vanished. It moved quietly through time, carried in the instincts of those who sought to understand the world. The first physicians who catalogued herbs, the first builders who measured the arc of bridges, the first astronomers who charted constellations, all were, in some forgotten way, continuing the work of the gods. Each act of discovery was a faint echo of Enki's curiosity and Ninhursag's precision. Modern scholars often read the myths as metaphors, but perhaps they are more than that. Perhaps they are records of perception, attempts to preserve the sense of wonder that arises when knowledge and reverence coexist. The ancients did not separate the sacred from the scientific. They saw the two as reflections of one another, each giving meaning to the other. To study the flow of water was to study the thoughts of Enki. To witness the birth of a child was to see Ninhursag at work. The world was their laboratory, their temple, their scripture. Even their myths of punishment and disaster, the flood, the drought, the rebellion, can be read as lessons about imbalance. When humanity forgot the harmony between creation and care, the world responded. The message was never one of vengeance, but of correction. Every storm, every change in the river's path, was a reminder of equilibrium lost and found again. In that rhythm they saw divine wisdom, the principle that order renews itself through chaos, that destruction is only transformation unrecognized. The deeper one reads into the old hymns, the clearer this becomes. The gods do not act irrationally. They maintain equilibrium. Ninhursag does not destroy her creations. She teaches them endurance. Enki does not hoard knowledge. He distributes it. The divine experiment that began with clay and breath was, at its core, an education, an invitation for humanity to learn the same laws that govern heaven and earth. In later ages, that invitation was misunderstood. The gods became distant, their knowledge hidden behind superstition and fear. But the traces remained. The architecture of ancient temples still follows their geometry. The agricultural calendars still align with their cycles. Even the idea that wisdom must be used with compassion, that knowledge without empathy leads to ruin, is an inheritance of their myth. Enki's curiosity without Ninhursag's restraint led to imbalance. Their story was the first lesson in responsibility. When people speak today of the mysteries of the ancients, they often imagine devices or powers long lost. Yet the true mystery was never mechanical. It was relational. It was the understanding that everything is connected, that thought, matter and emotion are parts of the same whole. The Sumerians built their civilization on that principle. Their irrigation systems mirrored the veins of the body. Their cities were laid out like constellations. Their laws followed the symmetry of nature. To live rightly was to live in resonance with the pattern. Perhaps that is why the myths still speak across millennia. They remind us that wisdom is not invention alone, but harmony between invention and care. The gods may have withdrawn from their temples, but their lessons remain in the structure of the world, in the balance of ecosystems, the cycles of time, the fragility that sustains beauty. What they knew, we still discover in fragments, that creation is a system of relationships, and that to understand it is to remember where we came from. The forgotten science of the gods is not buried in lost machines or hidden libraries. It is in the logic of the seed, in the structure of rivers, in the pulse of breath. It is the awareness that knowledge and reverence are the same thing when seen clearly. The myths whisper this truth again and again, even through their silence. And perhaps that is the reason the story of Ninhursag endures, because it is not only about the making of humanity, but about the making of understanding itself. Her touch shaped more than bodies, it shaped perception. Her patience taught the world that wisdom must move with compassion. Her legacy is not written only in stone, but in the way people still look at the earth with wonder, still seek balance, still try to learn without forgetting to care. In the end, the old myths do not ask us to believe in gods. They ask us to remember the pattern that once connected them to us, the pulse of creation, the rhythm of balance, the quiet intelligence of life itself. It is a science written not in books, but in the wind, the soil, and the stars. And if one listens long enough, with the same patience as the mother who first shaped us, one might still hear it, the whisper of the gods reminding the clay to remember what it once was. Long after the temples fell, long after the languages that once sang the names of the gods turned to dust, humanity remained. Cities rose from the same earth that had once been moulded by divine hands. The rivers shifted course, the deserts expanded and retreated, and the stories of the beginning became whispers shared by firesides, retold in fragments, reimagined by poets who no longer remembered where they came from. Yet beneath all the forgetting, something persisted. The old pulse remained, faint but steady, the rhythm of creation echoing quietly within the living. The Sumerians had once said that when Ninhursag breathed upon the clay, she left a fragment of herself in it. Every breath drawn by her creation carried the memory of that moment. It was not a metaphor to them, it was truth. The divine spark was not somewhere above, it was within. The air that filled the lungs of humanity was the same that had once flowed from her lips. To live was to breathe the goddess. To die was to return to her embrace in the soil. Thousands of years later, the words have changed, but the instinct remains. People still feel the earth as something more than substance. They speak of it as home, as mother, as something that feels. When they dig their hands into soil, when they plant, when they build, something ancient stirs. They may not call it Ninhursag, but the sensation is the same, that life is circular, that creation never ended, that we are made of the same matter that once listened and learned to speak. The old myths call this continuity the memory of clay. They said the clay never forgets. The hands that shape it may change, the fires that harden it may vary, but within it remains the record of every touch it has ever received. It remembers the warmth of the goddess's fingers, the first breath of air that moved across its surface, the first pulse that made it rise from stillness into life. To the ancient mind, that memory was not symbolic. It was the foundation of existence, that matter itself carries consciousness in some quiet form, that the world is alive because it remembers. When humanity looks back toward its beginnings, the oldest stories always circle back to this idea that we are not separate from the world, but continuous with it. The clay became flesh, the breath became thought, and through both, the divine continues to move. The gods may have withdrawn from sight, but their experiment never ended. It became us. The Sumerians, who once lived under the watch of ziggurats and the flow of sacred rivers, believed that their daily acts maintained the balance of creation. To plant was to renew the covenant of life. To build was to honour the structure of the cosmos. To speak was to shape reality. They were not wrong. Every generation since has repeated those same gestures, each in its own way, often without knowing why. The memory of clay works quietly, guiding the hands of those who no longer remember its name. It lives in the way a sculptor feels the weight of his material, in the way a mother holds her child, in the way a farmer presses a seed into the ground. It lives in the breath drawn before a word is spoken, in the pause between thoughts, in the silent awe that arises when the sky glows after rain. The same divine pattern that once turned earth into life still hums beneath every human act of care. In a sense, humanity never ceased being part of that first creation. Every new discovery, every work of art, every act of compassion is an echo of the goddess's design, the union of knowledge and love, of structure and tenderness. The clay continues to evolve, to learn, to create in return. Ninhursag's work was not to make finished beings, but to begin an endless process of becoming. Somewhere deep in the human awareness lies the trace of that understanding. When people speak of inspiration, of the feeling that something greater moves through them, it is the same breath returning. When they speak of conscience, of the small voice that urges care over cruelty, that too is her echo. The compassion of the one who shaped life not for domination but for balance. Modern minds call it instinct, empathy or connection to nature. The ancients called it divinity within. They believed that each life was a continuation of the goddess's labour, that each heartbeat was the hammering of clay from the inside out. Even death was not an ending but a return, the clay dissolving back into the earth, ready to be shaped again. This understanding gave meaning to everything they did. To mistreat the land was to wound the mother. To harm another person was to desecrate the clay. To heal, to nurture, to build was to honour her. The ethics of creation were written in the same pattern as its physics. What is done to the world is done to oneself, because both are of the same substance. It is a truth that still lingers, even if spoken in different languages. Archaeologists uncover tablets and see only myth, but within those stories lies a worldview so intimate that it still feels modern. The Sumerians did not fear their gods. They collaborated with them. The divine was not a master but a teacher, not distant but present in every material thing. To live in awareness of that presence was the highest wisdom. In the quiet of the present, the same lesson waits to be heard again. The memory of clay is not bound to time or belief. It moves through every culture that has ever looked at the earth and seen life reflected in it. It appears in the rituals of harvest, in the instinct to bury the dead in soil, in the reverence for mountains, trees and rivers. It appears in the urge to create art, to shape, to give form to thought. All of these are expressions of the same ancient inheritance, the drive to bring spirit into matter, to continue the goddess's gesture. Even science, in its most dispassionate form, still carries traces of that devotion. To study the composition of the earth, to trace the origins of life, to understand the elements that form the body, is to rediscover what the ancients already intuited, that we are not separate from the world but made of it, that the same atoms which form mountains and stars also form us. In that realization lies reverence, whether named or not. When one stands in silence and feels the wind move across the skin, there is no need for temples. The breath itself is prayer. The pulse is memory. The world, with all its complexity and impermanence, is still the same living experiment that began when Ninhursag mixed water and earth. Humanity continues to shape and be shaped, to build and rebuild, to destroy and heal, to forget and remember. It is all part of the same rhythm, the same cycle of becoming. The goddess's story ends not in triumph or tragedy, but in continuity. Her hands are no longer visible, but her work never stopped. Every act of creation, whether by gods or mortals, is hers. Every life born into the world repeats her first breath. Every time compassion overcomes cruelty, the old balance is restored for a moment, and the divine experiment continues. In the oldest hymns it was said that the goddess rested at the edge of the world, watching over the clay that had once been still. Her voice was the whisper of the wind, her touch the warmth of the soil. When the people prayed, they were not calling her down from the heavens, they were listening for her within themselves. That is how the ancients understood faith, not as obedience to something beyond, but as remembrance of something within. The world today may no longer sing her name, but the breath she gave has never ceased. It moves through the lungs of every living being, through the wind that circles the earth, through the quiet rhythm of tides. The memory of clay is the memory of belonging, the knowledge that creation was never something that happened once, but something that happens always. And if one listens closely, beneath the noise of cities and the hum of machines, beneath all the layers of forgetting, one can still hear it. The faint murmur of the goddess's breath within the world, the ancient heartbeat of the earth reminding us what we are. Clay that learned to dream, matter that remembers, life that still carries the warmth of the hands that first shaped it,